She had 2 sons and 1 plate of food, and no idea how much longer she could keep lying to them about tomorrow. Martha Hale hadn't slept in 3 days. Her husband was gone, not dead, just gone, and the town of Caldwell Crossing had already decided what that made her. The neighbors turned their eyes away. The merchants turned their backs. And when a stranger showed up at her door in the dead of August heat with a sack of flour and a side of smoked pork, she didn't ask his name. She just stood there in the doorway and tried not to cry in front of her boys. If you've ever had to choose between your pride and your children's hunger, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came down on the Texas Hill Country like a punishment. Not the kind of heat that made people slow and sleepy. The kind that cracked the earth open, that turned the creek behind the Hale property into a brown trickle by the first week of July, that made the chickens stop laying and the garden go pale and brittle before anything had a real chance to grow. It was the kind of heat that reminded people, the ones without money, without connections, without a man's name to shelter under, exactly how exposed they were. Martha Hale woke before sunrise most mornings, not because she was a naturally early riser, but because she'd stopped being able to sleep past 4. Her mind got to working the moment her eyes opened. Flour. She had maybe enough for 2 more batches of bread, maybe 3 if she stretched it with cornmeal. Salt pork. Gone. The last of it had gone into a pot of beans 2 nights ago, and the beans themselves were running low. She had 11 cents in a cracked ceramic jar on the windowsill, money she'd been hoarding for 3 weeks, and she hadn't been able to bring herself to spend it because once it was gone, she wasn't sure what came after. She lay there in the gray morning light listening to her boys breathe in the next room. Eli was 9, Daniel was 6. They shared a rope bed that listed slightly to one side because 2 of the legs were uneven, and they slept tangled together the way boys that age do, all elbows and bent knees like a couple of dogs. She could hear them from where she was, and Daniel's soft, even snoring, Eli's occasional shift and murmur. She had done in this life a number of things she was proud of. Getting those 2 boys through the last 8 months was at the top of the list. Robert Hale had left in November. He hadn't announced it, hadn't argued about it, hadn't even given her the dignity of a clean confrontation. He'd just gone. One morning he was there, sullen and thin-faced, smelling of the cheap whiskey he'd been drinking more and more of, and the next morning he wasn't. He'd taken his coat, his boots, and the mule. He'd left the broken plow, the half-dead garden, the leaking roof, and the 2 boys who still, even now, 8 months later, sometimes asked when their father was coming back. Martha had stopped answering that question honestly around month 2. Now she just said, "I don't know, baby," and moved on. The town of Caldwell Crossing had made its feelings about Robert Hale's departure fairly clear without saying much at all. That was the thing about a small frontier town. It didn't need to be loud about its judgments. The way Clara Prentice from the general store let a beat of silence hang in the air before she said, "Good morning, Mrs. Hale." The way the men outside the feed store stopped talking when Martha walked past. The way Reverend Deering's wife had come to call once in January, drank tea, said nothing useful, and never came back. The town had decided, without a trial or conversation or anything so formal as a verdict, that a woman whose husband had left her was probably a woman who deserved it. Maybe she'd been cold. Maybe she'd been difficult. Maybe she hadn't managed her household right. It didn't matter which particular failure they'd assigned her. What mattered was that they had assigned her one, and that assignment had followed her into every store, every Sunday service, every brief and uncomfortable exchange at the well. She was 29 years old, and she felt about 45. That particular morning in early August, she got up and started the fire before the sun was fully over the ridge, and she stood over the small iron stove and thought about the food situation with the same grim focus she imagined a general might apply to a losing battle. She had a handful of dried beans, some cornmeal, a bit of lard, and about half a cup of flour. She also had 3 eggs from the 2 remaining chickens, which she considered a minor miracle. She could make cornbread. She could stretch the beans into something that resembled a meal. If she was careful, she could make it cover breakfast and supper both. The boys came in around 7, still warm and tumble-haired from sleep. Daniel immediately wanted to know what was for breakfast. "Cornbread," Martha said. "Again?" "Yes, again. Sit down." Eli was sharper than his brother, and he was at an age where he'd started noticing things. The way Martha sometimes moved food from her own plate to theirs when she thought they weren't looking. The way she always seemed to have just eaten when they asked. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything, just watched her with those two old eyes of his. "Mama," he said after a minute. "What? Are we okay?" She turned from the stove and looked at her son. His face was thin, thinner than it should have been, though she'd tried to hide it from herself. His shirt was clean, but it was getting too small for him, the cuffs hitting almost at his elbows now. He'd grown a full inch since Christmas, and she hadn't had the money to account for it. "We're fine," she said. "Eat your breakfast." He didn't push it. That was maybe the worst part. He'd learned not to push it, which meant he'd already understood that there were things she couldn't fix by talking about them. She sent the boys outside after breakfast. Daniel ran off immediately to do whatever it was Daniel did. He had an entire inner world that he retreated into, mostly involving sticks and rocks arranged in formations she never quite understood. Eli went to the garden and started pulling weeds without being asked, which was both helpful and heartbreaking in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. Martha washed the 2 tin plates in the pot and let the water sit afterward because there was no reason to waste it. Then she stood in her kitchen, if you could call it that. It was more of a corner of a room. And she looked at the shelf where the food was, and she did the math again. The math she'd already done twice before sunrise, and the answer came out the same as it always did. She needed to figure something out, soon. The cabin itself was in rough shape. Robert had never been much of a carpenter, even when he was present, and in the last year before he left, he'd stopped maintaining anything at all. 2 of the porch boards were rotted through. The roof over the sleeping room leaked when it rained, though rain had been rare enough this summer to make that almost an academic problem. The door to the main room didn't hang right. She had to lift and shove it every time. And one of the window shutters had lost a hinge and was being held up by a length of rope she'd jury-rigged in March and kept meaning to fix properly. She was not a woman who sat around waiting for help. She'd grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Kerr County, the second of 5 children, and her father had held the opinion that everyone on the property contributed or they didn't eat, and that opinion had applied equally to sons and daughters. She could mend, she could cook, she could patch a roof with reasonable competence, she could butcher a hog, she could drive a wagon. What she couldn't do was be in multiple places at once, or conjure money out of nothing, or make a community of people decide to treat her like a human being when they'd already made up their minds otherwise. She was standing on the porch, looking out at the road, when she first saw him. He came down the creek road from the north, which was unusual. Most traffic through Caldwell Crossing came from the main road to the south, from the direction of town. This man was coming from the other way, which meant either he'd come from the Mercer spread or from the empty land further up the valley, or he'd simply taken a different route than most people bothered with. He was riding a gray horse, not young, but not broken down either, and he had a pack mule on a lead rope behind him. The mule was loaded. Martha watched him without moving from the porch. She'd learned to be watchful about strangers on the road. Not afraid exactly. She kept Robert's old shotgun by the door and she knew how to use it. But careful. A woman alone with 2 children was a particular kind of target, and while Caldwell Crossing wasn't a violent place by frontier standards, it wasn't entirely safe either. The man slowed when he saw her. He didn't stop immediately. He seemed to be making a decision. And then he turned the gray horse off the road and came up the short track toward the cabin. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Maybe something rougher. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, lean in the way that men who worked hard outside got lean, with a jaw that needed a shave and dark eyes that moved over the property with a calm, assessing look that wasn't quite calculating but wasn't entirely innocent either. He wore a plain canvas coat despite the heat, the kind with deep pockets, and he held himself in the saddle the way a man did when riding was something he'd been doing so long he'd stopped thinking about it. He stopped the horse about 20 feet from the porch. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was plain. Not particularly southern, not particularly anything. "Afternoon," Martha said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The gray horse dropped its head and blew out a breath through its nose. "I'm looking for the Hale place," the man said. "You found it." He looked at her, then at the cabin, then back at her. "You Martha Hale?" "Who's asking?" He swung down from the horse in one easy motion, dropped the reins, The horse stood, trained, and walked up to the edge of the porch. He reached into his coat, and for 1/2 second, Martha's hand moved toward the door frame where the shotgun was, and then she saw he was pulling out a folded piece of paper. "My name's Silas Creed," he said, holding the paper out. "I was a friend of your father's. He wrote to me, about 6 months ago, I guess. Letter took a while to find me." Martha looked at the paper and didn't take it yet. "My father's been dead since February." "I know, I'm sorry." He didn't say it the way most people said it, the reflexive way, the way that meant nothing. He just said it flat and straight, like he meant it to be true. "He wrote to me before he passed. Said you were out here by yourself and having a hard time of it." She looked at him. She looked at the mule, which was loaded with several canvas sacks, and what appeared to be, lashed to one side, a smoked side of pork wrapped in burlap. Her chest did something complicated that she would have been angry about if she'd had the energy to be angry. "I don't need charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a favor to a man I owed a debt to. He asked me to check on his daughter. I'm checking." "Well?" She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Consider me checked on." "The roof's leaking," he said, not as an accusation, just a statement. He was looking at the front corner of the cabin where the wood had a gray, weather-beaten look that meant problems underneath. "I know what my roof is doing. I can fix it. I don't need Mrs. Hale." He said it quietly, without impatience. "I've got a side of pork, 40 pounds of flour, dried beans, salt, coffee, and a set of tools on that mule. I've got no particular place to be for the next 3 weeks. I owe your father. That's the whole story." She stood there. She was aware, in a distant way, that Eli had come around the corner of the cabin and was standing in the yard, watching. Daniel was behind him, peering around his brother's shoulder. She looked at Silas Creed's face, and she tried to find a reason not to trust it. She'd had enough experience with men whose faces lied to her that she'd gotten reasonably good at it. But there was nothing there she could catch. No oil, no angle, no particular wanting. He just looked like a man who was tired and who had a debt to pay, and who was being straightforward about it. "You can water your horse at the trough," she said finally, "and then I suppose you'd better unload that mule." He nodded, once, like that was exactly what he'd expected her to say, and turned back to his animals. He slept in the barn. He'd offered before she could say anything, which told her something about him, that he understood the situation without needing it explained. She made supper that night from what he'd brought, and it was the first genuinely filling meal she'd put on the table in longer than she wanted to think about. Salt pork fried in the pan, beans cooked down soft with a bit of onion from the garden, cornbread made with real flour that didn't have to be stretched with anything. She watched her boys eat, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the table. Silas ate what was on his plate and didn't make a production of it. He asked Eli how old he was and what he knew about horses, and when Eli, who was shy around strangers usually, started actually talking, Silas just listened. He didn't perform interest. He was just interested. "You know much about the land up the valley?" Martha asked, after they'd cleared the plates. The boys had gone to bed. "Some," he said. He was sitting with his coffee, the cup held in both hands. "I came through Mercer's spread on the way in. He's been buying up land from the look of it. Lot of new fence posts that weren't there 3-4 years back." Martha went still. "You've been through here before?" "Passed through once, long time ago. Different circumstances." He didn't elaborate and she didn't press. "Gideon Mercer," she said. The name sat in her mouth like something sour. There's been talk about a freight road going north through the valley." "My land sits across the only practical route." She looked at her hands on the table. "He's offered to buy it twice. I've said no twice." Silas looked at her over his coffee. "And he didn't like that. He's not a man who expects to be told no." She paused. "He's also not a man who generally has to be. What's he doing about it?" "So far, mostly talk. His people in town, they've made it clear I'm not particularly welcome in certain places." She let out a short breath, though that was already more or less the case. Silas set his cup down. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and there was something in his face she couldn't read. Not quite anger, something quieter than that, something with more patience in it. "Well," he said, "one thing at a time. Roof first, I think.
Is he?
He started on the roof the next morning. Martha watched him from the yard, or rather, she did not specifically watch him. She simply worked in the yard and was aware of him because he was there, on her roof, pulling off damaged shingles and stacking them and examining what was underneath with the focused competence of someone who'd done this before. He'd borrowed Eli for the lower work, and she could hear them up there. The sound of hammering, the occasional short exchange of words, Eli asking something, Silas answering. She went to the garden and weeded for an hour and thought about what the neighbors would think when word got around that there was a man at the Hale place. There was no version of that story that ended well for her reputation, but she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she cared about it less than she might have expected. Her reputation in Caldwell Crossing was already what it was. It didn't have a lot of distance left to fall. What she was more concerned about was the legal paper she'd received 2 weeks ago. She'd read it 4 times and understood most of it, but the parts she didn't understand were the parts that worried her. It had Gideon Mercer's lawyer's name on it, a man named Pollard from out of Bandera, and it made reference to a surveying dispute regarding the eastern boundary of her property. She'd never heard of any surveying dispute. She'd looked at her deed, the one she'd gotten from her father when she and Robert had come out here 7 years ago, and it seemed clear enough to her, but she wasn't a lawyer and she'd been afraid to ask anyone in town because she didn't know whose side they were on. She was going to have to figure that out. The third day she caught him looking at the old smokehouse behind the barn. It hadn't been used in years. Robert had let it fall into disrepair like everything else. But the structure was basically sound. She'd been using it as a storage shed. "Your father built this?" Silas asked. "No, that was here when we came, previous owner. But my father taught me how to use one like it." She paused. "I used to help him when I was a girl. He made good smoked pork, had a particular way of doing it." Silas looked at her sideways. "You know the process?" "I know it well enough." She heard something in her own voice, something she hadn't heard in a while, and it took her a moment to identify it. It was the sound of herself talking about something she was actually good at. "Why? Smokehouse looks sound, needs the firebox rebuilt, maybe a day's work. You've got the recipe." He said it like he was just lining up facts. "Town's got a good-sized road market on Saturdays. People come in from the farms around. They stop and spend money if there's something worth buying." She looked at him. "You're suggesting I sell smoked meat." "I'm suggesting you've got skills, and you've got a facility, and there's a market 3 miles down the road." He shrugged. "I'm not suggesting anything, really. Just noticing things out loud." Martha looked at the smokehouse. She thought about Gideon Mercer and his lawyers and the 11 cents in the jar on the windowsill that she'd spent 2 weeks ago on salt, when she'd finally had to, and still hadn't replaced. She thought about her boys eating at that table 3 nights ago like they hadn't been hungry. "The firebox," she said. "How long to rebuild it?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. "And the wood for the smoking?" "I know what I need. I know how to source it." "I can help you cut it." She was quiet for a moment. There was something about accepting help that still felt like swallowing something the wrong way, something her pride would rather cough back up. She'd been raised to be capable, and somewhere in the last 8 months, capable had started to mean alone. And she was only now beginning to wonder if that was actually what it meant, or if that was just what defeat felt like when you dressed it up in better clothes. "All right," she said. "Let's look at it." "But..." She went to town the following Saturday, which was a thing she did as infrequently as she could manage. She brought 3 sides of smoked pork, wrapped in cloth, in the back of the wagon. She'd spent 4 days on them, more careful than she'd been with anything in months, remembering the exact sequence her father had used, the dry rub, the thyme, the particular blend of wood smoke. She set up at the edge of the road market, which was mostly farmers with vegetables and a couple of women selling pies, and one man with a cart full of harness leather. For the first hour, no one stopped. She'd expected it. She stood behind her small table in the August heat, and she kept her face neutral, and she watched people notice her and look away. Claire Prentice from the general store walked past with her husband and did not make eye contact. 2 men from the feed store sidestepped her table with the slightly theatrical precision of men pretending not to notice something. And then an old farmer she didn't recognize. He'd come in from somewhere further up the valley. She could tell by the dust on his boots. stopped and looked at what she had and asked how much. She told him. He bought a side, didn't haggle, picked it up, sniffed it, said good smoke on this, and put his money on the table. 20 minutes later, a woman Martha knew only slightly, Louise Ferris, married to one of the smaller ranchers east of town, stopped and bought another. After that, a young man who worked at the livery. By noon, she'd sold everything she'd brought. She drove home with 42 cents in her pocket, which was more money than she'd held in one hand since the spring, and something moving around in her chest that she was careful not to call hope yet, because hope felt like a thing you could lose, but it was close. Silas was fixing the porch boards when she got back. Eli was handing him nails with the focused seriousness of a boy who's been given a real job and takes it seriously. Daniel was sitting on the repaired section of porch, dragging a stick along the railing, watching everything. "How'd you do?" Silas asked, not looking up. "Sold out." He looked up then. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, something quieter, like he'd expected it and was pleased to be right. "How much did you bring?" Eli asked. "Enough," Martha said. And then, because he was her son and he'd been carrying too much weight for too long, and she could afford this small moment, more than enough. Eli broke into a grin that she didn't see often enough. It changed his whole face. She unhitched the horse and walked it to the trough and stood there in the heat of the afternoon letting herself breathe. Above the ridge, the sky was the particular blue that comes after a long dry spell, dense and bright, and the creek behind the property had a thin sound to it that was almost water. She thought about her father. She thought about him writing that letter to Silas Creed, putting faith in a favor owed across however many miles between them. She didn't know the full story of what was between those two men, and she'd decided not to ask yet. There was a right time for that conversation, and she'd know it when it came. She thought about the letter from Mercer's lawyer, still sitting folded on the shelf above the fireplace. She thought about the firebox in the smokehouse that was now in working order, and the hickory and oak wood she and Silas had cut and stacked in cords along the south wall of the barn, enough for a dozen smoking runs. She thought about 42 cents and a sold-out table and an old farmer who'd said good smoke on this. The town could think what it wanted about the woman out on the creek road. She was done trying to manage what they thought. What she was going to do instead was build something so undeniable that they'd run out of things to say. That was what she told herself, standing at the horse trough in the last heat of the afternoon, listening to her son's voices somewhere behind her and the sound of hammer on board. She wasn't sure she entirely believed it yet, but she kept hearing that old farmer's voice in her head. Good smoke on this. Matter of fact. No hesitation. Like it was simply and plainly true. She let herself hold on to that for a while. That night, after supper, after the boys had gone to bed and the dishes were done, she unfolded the lawyer's letter and put it on the table. "I need someone to read this with me," she said. Silas pulled it toward him. He read it in silence, his face still. When he finished, he read it again. "When did you get this?" he asked. 3 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "He's claiming there's an unresolved boundary dispute from the original survey. Says the eastern quarter section may fall within land he acquired from a prior claim. That's what I understood. He stopped, started again. "It's a common enough tactic. The surveying records out here are a mess. Easy to manufacture confusion." "Can he do it? Take my land that way?" Silas folded the letter and pushed it back toward her. His jaw was tight. "He can try," he said. "Whether he succeeds is a different question." He looked at her. "There's a lawyer in Bandera, not Pollard, Pollard's Mercer's man, a man named Cartwright. He used to practice in San Antonio, knows land law. He's honest." "How do you know him?" A pause. "I know a lot of people." He looked at the table. "He'd take your case on, I think, if I asked him to." "Why would you ask him to?" Silas looked at her, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there yet. A kind of careful weight, like he was measuring what to say. "Because Gideon Mercer has been doing this for a long time," he said, "to a lot of people, and because someone should have stopped him before now." He paused. "And because your father asked me to look after you, and I take that seriously." She looked at him. The lamp on the table put a warm light on the room, and outside the summer night was loud with crickets and the distant sound of coyotes on the ridge. "Silas," she said. "What happened between you and my father?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "He was the only man in a difficult situation who treated me with any decency." That's enough, isn't it? It wasn't the whole story. She could hear the absence of it, but she nodded because she'd learned to hear what a person was willing to say and honor the space around it. "I'll write to Cartwright in the morning," he said. "All right," she said. She folded the letter and put it back on the shelf. Then she went to the window and stood in the dark, looking out at the yard where the repaired porch caught a bit of moonlight, and the barn stood solid and quiet with the animals inside, and somewhere in the distance, the creek made its thin, tired sound through the drought. She had 42 cents. She had a functioning smokehouse. She had a lawyer's name on a piece of paper and a man she didn't entirely understand sleeping in her barn who might be the closest thing to an ally she'd had in longer than she could clearly remember. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had last week. She went to bed, and for the first time in months, she slept past 4. The letter to Cartwright went out on a Tuesday, tucked into the mail pouch on the stage that ran through Caldwell Crossing every week, heading south toward Bandera. Martha had watched Silas write it at her kitchen table. A clean, unhurried hand, the kind that suggested someone who'd done a fair amount of writing at some point in his life, though she still hadn't worked out exactly what that life had looked like. He'd read the finished letter to her before folding it. It was plain and direct, explained the situation with the land claim, named Gideon Mercer, described the letter from Pollard, and asked Cartwright to advise. He signed his own name to it rather than hers, which she'd noticed but not commented on. "You think he'll respond?" she asked. "He'll respond," Silas said. "Might take 2 weeks. Could be 3, depending on what he's working on. 2 or 3 weeks. Martha did the quiet arithmetic of what she could accomplish in that time. She had enough hickory stacked for 3 more smoking runs, maybe 4 if she was careful with the wood. She had the beginnings of something. Not a business, not yet, she wouldn't let herself call it that, but the beginnings of a pattern. Something she could repeat. She needed to smoke more meat before Saturday, and she needed to find a way to get more pork to smoke, which meant she needed to talk to someone at the slaughterhouse in town, which meant walking into a place where she'd be assessed and found wanting before she opened her mouth. She did it anyway. The slaughterhouse sat at the south edge of Caldwell Crossing, run by a wide, red-faced man named Abner Goss, who smelled permanently of sawdust and iron and had hands the size of small shovels. He was not precisely unfriendly to Martha when she came in on Wednesday morning. He was unfriendly to most people, as a matter of general operating principle. But there was a moment when she told him what she wanted, that he looked at her with the specific kind of skepticism reserved for people he'd already been told stories about. "You're the Hale woman," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "You're smoking meat to sell." "That's correct." He chewed the inside of his cheek. "I got regular buyers for the good cuts." "I'm not asking for the good cuts. I'm asking for what you'd otherwise salt down or render. The lesser joints, the cheaper cuts. I can work with what most people don't want." He looked at her for another long moment. She held his gaze and did not fidget. "It's good smoke," she said. "I sold out last Saturday in 2 hours. Ask around." She didn't know if anyone would confirm it. The people who'd bought from her weren't necessarily the type to volunteer opinions in her favor, but she said it with enough certainty that it landed. Abner Goss scratched the back of his neck. "I can give you the picnic shoulders and the belly cuts, whatever I've got left Thursday afternoons." "What's your price?" He named a number. She countered. He thought about it and came down a fraction, which wasn't much but was something. They shook hands on it with the brief, businesslike formality of 2 people who didn't entirely trust each other and were both fine with that. Walking out of the slaughterhouse with the first arrangement she'd made for herself in longer than she could remember, Martha realized she was gripping the strap of her bag hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She made herself let go. The gossip started that same week, which she'd expected. She'd have been surprised if it hadn't. The first version she heard directly was from Louise Ferris, the rancher's wife who'd bought from her at the market, and who stopped by the cabin on Thursday with a basket of early squash from her garden. Louise was a solid, practical woman about 10 years older than Martha, with a broad face and a manner that was kind without being soft, and she had the slightly apologetic air of someone delivering news they hadn't chosen to carry.
I thought you should know, Louise said, setting the squash on the porch and not quite meeting Martha's eyes, that there's talk in town. There's always talk in town. This is more specific than usual. Louise glanced toward the barn, where the sound of hammering indicated that Silas was working on something. People are saying you've got a man living on your property. He's sleeping in the barn. He was a friend of my father's. I believe you, Louise said. I'm not saying I think anything about it. I'm saying other people are saying things. What things? Louise pressed her lips together. You know what things? Martha looked at her. What does Clara Prentice say? She says, Louise stopped, started again. She says it explains why your husband left. The words landed like something physical. Martha stood very still and let the sound of hammering from the barn fill the space between them. A bird somewhere was making a repetitive, irritating sound in the oak tree by the fence. Thank you for telling me, Martha said. Her voice came out even, which she was proud of. I told her it was a wicked thing to say, Louise said quickly. I want you to know that. I told her exactly that. Did it change anything? Louise's silence was its own answer. After she left, Martha stood on the repaired porch boards. She could feel the solidity of them under her feet, the new wood, the careful work, and she breathed through the particular anger that has nowhere useful to go, the kind that comes from being lied about by people who haven't earned the right to have an opinion about your life. She let it move through her, and she did not go inside and cry, which had been her pattern for most of the last 8 months. She didn't have time for it, and she'd decided, sometime in the last 10 days, that she was done spending time on things that didn't get her somewhere. She went to the barn instead. Silas was reinforcing one of the stall walls where the timber had gotten soft. He had his back to her, and he didn't turn around immediately, just said, Hand me that other hammer, would you? And she found it on the barrel beside the door and held it out. He turned and took it, and then looked at her face and put the hammer down. What happened? He said. Nothing I didn't expect. She leaned against the stall door. There's talk in town about you being here. He was quiet for a moment. I can find another place to sleep. No, she said. That's not... She stopped. I'm not asking you to leave. I needed to tell someone who wouldn't make me feel like I was supposed to be ashamed of it. She looked at the barn floor. Clara Prentice is saying you're the reason Robert left. Silas made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I was 100 miles away when Robert left. I know that. And he left because he was a man who didn't want to stay. I know that too. She looked up at him. It doesn't stop it from being the story they're telling. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was thinking something through before he said it. Mrs. Hale, Martha. He said it carefully, like he was testing the word. You can't stop what people say. You can only decide whether it slows you down. He picked the hammer back up. Does it slow you down? She thought about it. Not today, she said. Good, he said, and turned back to the stall wall. She was at the smokehouse the next morning before sunrise, getting the fire going in the firebox, feeding the wood in at the angle that would give the slow, even smoke she wanted. The pork shoulders from Abner Goss were brined and resting, ready to go in. She had the process running in her head the way her father had taught her. Not a set of instructions exactly, more like a feel, a knowledge that lived in the hands and the nose and the sense of time passing, the way you learned it by doing it next to someone else who already knew. She'd done this with him. That was the thing. Her father, his name was Franklin Decker, he'd come out to Kerr County from Kentucky before the war, before Martha was born, had kept a smokehouse behind his barn, and he'd treated the process with a seriousness that other men reserved for more obviously important things. The smoke has to have patience, he'd told her once, when she was maybe 12 and fidgeting next to the firebox. You can't rush it. You're not cooking it. You're changing it. She'd been annoyed at the time, the way a 12-year-old is annoyed by things that are actually wisdom. She understood it now. She was tending the firebox when Eli appeared at the smokehouse door, still half asleep, his hair sticking up on one side. What are you doing up? She said. Smelled the smoke. He rubbed his eye with the heel of his hand. Can I help? She looked at him. In the low orange light from the firebox, he looked younger than 9.
the soft edges of his face still carrying something of the little boy he'd been before everything got hard. She'd worried, over the last months, about what the hardness was doing to him, whether she was making him old too fast. "Sit here," she said, and pointed to the crate she used as a step. "I'll show you how to read the smoke." He sat down, wide awake now, watching everything. She taught him the way her father had taught her. Not by lecturing, just by talking while she worked, explaining what she was looking for, what color the smoke should be and why, what too much heat smells like versus the right heat, how long a shoulder should sit and when you'd know it was done. He asked questions. Some of them were smart questions, the kind that showed he was actually thinking about what she was saying. She answered them. At some point, she realized she'd been talking for half an hour, and the sun was starting to lighten the sky above the ridge, and she felt she wasn't sure. Something she hadn't felt in a while, like a person who had knowledge worth passing on. "Mama," Eli said after a pause. "Yeah." "Are we going to be okay? Really?" She looked at the smoke drifting up from the firebox. Thought about 42 cents in her pocket on a Saturday afternoon. Thought about Abner Goss's handshake. Thought about the lawyer's letter on its way to Bandera. "I think so," she said. And this time she meant it differently than she'd meant it before. In the kitchen, when she'd been lying to protect him. "I think we actually might be." The second Saturday market, she brought twice as much and sold out faster. The third Saturday, she ran out of everything before noon, and 2 people asked if she could bring more the following week. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a problem that was too much demand. It didn't solve anything. The Mercer situation was still there, the lawyer's letter hadn't come yet, the eastern boundary of her property was still contested territory on paper, but it did something to her spine, straightened something that had been bending for months. She drove home the third Saturday with just over $1.50, and she sat in the wagon on the road back with the reins loose in her hands and let herself feel it, briefly, before she made herself start thinking about the following week. She was crossing the creek bridge about a mile from home when she heard the horse behind her. She didn't look back immediately. Then she did. Gideon Mercer was riding toward her on a big bay horse, alone, which was unusual. He normally traveled with at least one hired man. He was 60-something, thick through the middle, with a white handlebar mustache and the kind of permanent deep tan that came from years in the Texas sun. He dressed better than most men in the county. Good boots, good coat, a hat that had been made for him rather than bought off a shelf. He rode with the easy authority of a man who'd never had to think too hard about whether he belonged somewhere. He pulled up alongside her wagon. "Mrs. Hale," he said. His voice was pleasant, which was the thing about Mercer that people sometimes forgot. He was always pleasant. It was one of the things that made him effective. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and kept the wagon moving. He matched her pace without any apparent effort. "I heard you've been doing some business at the market." "That's right. Good for you." He said it like he was handing her something. "Industry is a virtue. I've always believed that." She didn't respond. "I also heard," he said, still pleasant, "that you haven't been giving any more thought to my offer on the property." "That's right, too." He was quiet for a moment. The road ran between 2 low hills here, cottonwood trees along the creek, the particular dry green smell of August. It was a beautiful piece of land, Martha had always thought. Even when things were at their worst, she'd noticed that. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be straightforward with you," Mercer said. "I'm not a man who enjoys drawn-out unpleasantness. The freight road is going to get built. It's going to happen whether your property is part of the arrangement or not. What I'm offering you is a chance to benefit from it in a reasonable way, rather than be run over by it in an unreasonable one." "Your lawyer sent me a letter about a boundary dispute," Martha said. "I'm looking into it." Something shifted in Mercer's face, so small you'd almost miss it. A slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in the set of his mouth, gone in an instant. "Routine matter," he said. "Old survey records. These things happen out here." "I'm sure they do," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She kept her eyes on the road. "You have a man out at your place," he said. "I have a guest of my family," she said. "Silas Creed," Mercer said. She looked at him then, because the way he said the name was different from the pleasant way he'd been saying everything else. Just slightly. The pleasantness was still there on the surface, but underneath it, for just a second, she heard something that sounded like it had edges. "You know him," she said. Not a question.
I know of him, Mercer said, easily. Back to Pleasant. Man gets around by all accounts. I'd be careful about who you take into your confidence, Mrs. Hale, particularly in your situation. My situation, she said flatly. A woman alone, vulnerable to certain kinds of, well, people who might see an opportunity. He smiled, and the smile was entirely charming, which made it worse. I'm saying it out of genuine concern. Thank you for the concern, she said. Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer. She flicked the reins, and the horse moved on. She didn't look back. She could hear his horse standing on the road behind her for a long moment before she heard it turn and go the other direction. Her hands were steady on the reins. That surprised her a little. She told Silas that evening. She said it the way she'd tell him about a piece of equipment that needed attention, plainly, without dramatizing it. When she got to the part about him saying Silas's name the way he had, she watched Silas's face. He was sitting on the porch step. He'd been whittling something for Daniel, a small horse, partway done. He kept working while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a bit. What's between you and Mercer? She asked. He set the whittling down. Nothing direct, he said. Not personally. He looked at his hands. I knew a family, about 4 years back. Couple named Teague, Aaron and Sarah. They had a spread about 40 miles north of here. Good land, timber, and water both. Mercer wanted it for a logging contract he had with a railroad. He paused. He did to them what he's trying to do to you. Manufactured a boundary dispute, pressured the county recorder, found a judge who owed him favors. What happened to them? They lost the land. Aaron Teague died the winter after. I don't know if it was the land or something else that was already wrong with him, but it happened close enough together that I've never been able to separate them in my head. Sarah took the children back east. He was quiet. I helped them during it, tried to help them. I wasn't able to stop it. Martha looked at him. That's why my father's letter mattered, she said slowly. You knew what Mercer was doing here. Silas picked up the whittling again. I was already planning to come through this part of the country, he said. Your father's letter just told me there was a specific reason to stop. She was quiet for a moment. She'd known on some level that there was more to this than a simple debt. You didn't ride 100 miles on the strength of owing a favor to a dead man unless something else was pulling you in the same direction. She supposed it didn't change anything. The result was the same. Mercer said to be careful about who I'd take into my confidence, she said. Silas looked at her. What did you say? I said thank you and drove away. She stood up from the step. I don't take his advice on people. He's not a reliable judge of character. Silas looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his face, not amusement, something quieter, that she filed away without commenting on. Cartwright's letter came on the 4th week, in the mail pouch on a Thursday. Martha was in the garden when Eli came running with it, and she made herself finish the row she was working before she went inside and opened it. She didn't want to read bad news kneeling in the dirt. It was 2 pages, written in a precise, small hand. She read it once fast and then again slowly. Silas read it after her without being asked, which she'd expected, and she watched his face while he read. He says the survey dispute is manufactured, she said. That's what I understood. That's right. The original survey from 1874 is clean. He's looked at the county records. Pollard is filing a claim based on a secondary survey done in 1881 that Mercer apparently paid for privately. The legal standing of private surveys in a contested boundary case is weak. Silas set the letter down. He says he'll take it. What does he need from me? The original deed and whatever documents came with it when your father transferred the property, and he wants to meet with you. He can come up here or... I'll go to him, Martha said. It's my case. I should go. She thought about the trip. A day each way, she'd need to arrange for the boys. And then she thought about the Teague family and the judge who owed Mercer favors, and she set her jaw. Can you stay with the boys for 2 days? Silas looked at her with that slightly careful look. Yes, he said. Good. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box where she kept important papers. I'll go Monday. She didn't sleep well Sunday night.
She lay in the dark thinking about the road to Bandera and the original deed in the box and a lawyer she'd never met and whether any of it would be enough. She was aware, in the way you're aware of things you'd rather not think about, that Mercer had more money and more connections and more history in this county than she ever would. That the system that was supposed to protect her property had already been bent in small ways she couldn't entirely see yet. That the Teagues had had someone fighting for them too and had still lost. She got up at 3 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and did not feel sorry for herself, which she considered a kind of victory. Bandera was a 2-hour ride south, larger than Caldwell Crossing by a fair margin, with a proper main street and 2 hotels and a courthouse that had been built with some actual ambition. Martha had been there twice in the 7 years she'd been in the hill country, once for a land transaction, once when Eli had gotten sick enough to need a real doctor. Cartwright's office was on a side street off the main, a narrow room with a good-sized desk and bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls and a window that faced north and let in a cool gray light. He was a smaller man than she'd pictured, compact, maybe 50, with wire-rimmed glasses and a neat brown beard going gray at the edges. He shook her hand like a person, not like a woman, which she noticed. They spent 4 hours in that office. He asked her questions she hadn't thought to ask herself about the history of the property, about Robert's handling of the deed after her father transferred it, about any verbal conversations she'd had with Mercer's people, about the county recorder and whether she'd had any dealings with him. She answered everything as precisely as she could. When she wasn't sure, she said so. He seemed to appreciate that. The manufactured survey is the weak point, he said toward the end. A private survey conducted by a hired party with no certification from the county. It's flimsy. But flimsy isn't the same as dead. Mercer will have someone in front of a judge before long, and if he gets the right judge, he can drag this out for years and cost you more money in legal proceedings than the land is worth to you. What do you recommend? I recommend we move before he does, Cartwright said. File a preemptive challenge to the private survey's validity. Get the original survey into the record first. Make the judge look at the clean document before Pollard puts the contaminated one in front of him. He took his glasses off and cleaned them. There's also the broader picture. What broader picture? You're not the only one, Chum, he said. I know of at least 3 other families in this county who've received letters from Pollard in the last 2 years. 2 of them sold. 1 is still fighting. He looked at her. If there's a pattern, and I believe there is, that's a different kind of case than a single boundary dispute. That's something a district court takes seriously. Martha sat with that for a moment. Who's the other family still fighting? A man named Horace Beale, cattle ranch up near the Hale River crossing. He's been contesting for 14 months, running out of money. Can you connect us? Cartwright looked at her over his glasses. I can, he said, but I want to be straightforward with you, Mrs. Hale. Pursuing Mercer on a broader corruption case is a longer road than defending your property line. It's harder, it's more expensive, and it makes you a larger target. I'm already a target, she said. Might as well be a target for something worth doing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his glasses back on and picked up his pen. All right, he said. Let's talk about what we need. She got back to the cabin late Tuesday afternoon, road dusty and tired in the bones. Silas was on the porch. The boys came running when she came down the track. Daniel launched himself at her knees and she caught him and held on. Eli stood back a little, watching her face. How'd it go? Eli asked. Good, she said. We've got a lawyer, a real one. Silas came down off the porch. He held the horse while she climbed down from the saddle, and he looked at her face with the same quiet, reading look he had, and she gave him a small nod that meant we'll talk later, and he gave her a small nod back that meant understood. She went inside and stood in her kitchen and looked at the shelf where the food was. Full now, genuinely full, something she'd stopped taking for granted, and she pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Behind her, she could hear Daniel telling her about something that had happened with the chickens while she was gone, something involving a broken egg and a very bad decision. And the story was getting louder and more elaborate as he told it, and she started laughing before she entirely meant to. A laugh that was more relief than humor, the kind that comes when you've been holding something tight for a long time and you let it go just slightly. And then Eli said, Daniel was saying. I didn't say that, Eli said from the doorway. You absolutely said it.
I did not. Boys, Silas said from somewhere behind them, his voice flat and dry. Your mother just rode 40 miles. Give her 10 minutes. The argument stopped. Martha stood at the table with her head down, still laughing a little, and thought, I have to hold on to this. Whatever else happens, I have to remember that this happened. Ugh. That Friday, 3 things occurred in the same day that together sketched the shape of what was coming. The first was that Ben Holloway, who ran the hardware store, and who Martha had always considered one of the more quietly decent people in Caldwell Crossing, for whatever that was worth, stopped her on the main street and told her that someone had been going around saying her smoked meat was made with spoiled pork. Not loudly, not publicly, just quietly. In the way that things got around a small town. I don't believe it, Holloway said quickly. I'm telling you because I think you should know. Do you know who's saying it? I got it from Pete Colley at the livery, who got it from someone else. I didn't push for names. He looked uncomfortable in the way that decent people look when they've been made an unwilling participant in something ugly. The second thing was that when Martha went to give Abner Goss money for the next week's order of shoulders, he told her he'd already sold them to someone else. You gave me standing orders, she said. I gave you what I had left over, is what I gave you, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. This buyer came in Monday, offered me a better price for the whole lot. I can't turn down a better price. Who was the buyer? He was quiet for a second too long. Can't say. Abner. I can't say, Mrs. Hale. He did look at her then, and she saw under the bluster something that looked a little like guilt. I'm sorry. That's how it is. She walked out without another word. She stood on the street outside the slaughterhouse in the afternoon sun, and she thought about Mercer pulling alongside her wagon on the creek bridge and saying, Industry is a virtue, in that pleasant, patient voice of his, and she understood something that she'd known academically but was now knowing in her body. He wasn't going to come at her directly. He was never going to do anything you could point at and name plainly. He was going to work the edges, close the doors, dry up the supply, let the whispers do the damage that he didn't want his name on. She walked to the wagon. She climbed up. The third thing happened on the road home. She passed the road market site, which was quiet on Fridays, the road empty, and she saw that someone had dumped a load of manure at the edge of the spot where she usually set up, fresh enough that it was still steaming slightly in the afternoon heat. No one around. No explanation. Just there. She sat in the wagon and looked at it. She thought about her father and his smokehouse. She thought about Eli's face in the orange firebox light. She thought about Cartwright and the pattern he'd described. 3 families, 2 of them already gone, 1 still fighting with no money left. She thought about Mercer's empire, which had been built over years and years of exactly this kind of pressure. The quiet kind. The kind you couldn't quite pin down. Applied until people got tired and moved on, and the land changed hands and the world rearranged itself in his favor one more time. She sat there for what was probably 2 minutes. Then she picked up the reins. She had hickory wood stacked in the barn, and a smokehouse in working order, and a deal with Abner Goss that he'd just broken, and that she'd have to replace somehow with another source of pork. She had a lawyer in Bandera, and the original deed in a tin box, and a man named Horace Beale, 40 miles north, who'd been fighting for 14 months and was running out of money. She wasn't running out of money. She wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to let that happen. She drove home in the long afternoon light. By the time she came down the track to the cabin, the sun was low and red over the western ridge, and Silas was at the fence with Eli, showing him something about how to evaluate a fence post for rot, and Daniel was sitting on the new porch boards with a stick, and the chickens were making their evening noise in the yard. It looked, from a certain angle, almost ordinary, almost like something you could keep. She intended to keep it. She got down from the wagon, dusted off her skirt, and walked up to where Silas and Eli were standing at the fence. "We have a problem," she said. Silas looked at her. 3, actually, she said. "Come inside. I'll tell you about all of them." The pork problem got solved in a way Martha hadn't anticipated, which was that Louise Ferris came by 2 days after the Abner Goss situation and told her that her husband ran a small number of hogs on the east pasture and had more than he needed going into fall. "He'd sell you the whole animal at a fair price," Louise said. "You'd have to do the butchering yourself." "I know how to butcher a hog," Martha said. "I know you do. That's why I'm here." Louise paused. "Bill doesn't..." He's not a man who talks much. But he told me what Goss did was wrong. That's his way of saying something about it.
Martha looked at her. She'd been carefully not thinking about how alone she was in all of this, because that kind of thinking had a way of pulling you down into somewhere it was hard to climb out of. But this, a quiet man on the east pasture sending word through his wife that he thought something was wrong, this was the kind of small, ordinary decency that made it possible to keep going. "Tell Bill I appreciate it," she said. "I'll come by Thursday." The spoiled meat rumor she handled differently. She couldn't chase it from person to person. That was a losing strategy, chasing rumors. So instead she brought extra to the Saturday market, and she gave out small samples, no charge, to anyone who'd take one. Not making a production of it, not announcing anything. Just standing there with a clean cloth and strips of smoked pork and letting people taste it themselves. An old woman she didn't know bit into a piece and said, out loud to no one in particular, "That is not spoiled. Whoever said it was spoiled is a liar." Martha thanked her without making a big thing of it, but she filed that old woman's face away. In a town this size, there were people who mattered to the flow of information, and this woman, small, sharp-eyed, clearly not afraid of her own opinions, appeared to be one of them. She later learned her name was Vera Drummond, widow of a former county commissioner, and that when Vera Drummond said something, people tended to repeat it. The manure at the market spot she cleaned up herself. Got up before dawn on Saturday, drove in with a shovel, moved it to the roadside drainage ditch where it could do some good, and had her table set up by the time the first farm wagons came through. Nobody mentioned it. She didn't bring it up. The work got done, and the day moved on. Silas watched all of this with an expression she was starting to know. A kind of careful, attentive quiet, like a man listening to something he respects. "You're not rattled," he said one evening, and it came out sounding like a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "I'm rattled," she said. "I'm just not stopping." What she couldn't fix as easily was the town itself. Caldwell Crossing wasn't a large place. Maybe 300 people in the town proper, another 200 or 300 on the surrounding farms and ranches. And it had the particular social architecture of a place where everyone had known each other for long enough that the hierarchies were settled and nearly invisible. Mercer was at the top of that hierarchy, which meant his displeasure had weight. Not the kind of weight that announced itself. No one was going to come to Martha's door and tell her to stop selling smoked meat. The weight was quieter than that. It was in which tables at the boarding house went quiet when she walked past, in which children had been told, perhaps, not to play with Eli and Daniel, in the way that Ben Holloway's ordinary human decency existed, alongside the fact that he still didn't buy anything from her stand because he had a hardware order coming up for renewal with Mercer's freight operation, and he was keeping his head down. She understood it. She didn't like it, but she understood it. People had things to protect. Eli understood it too, and that was the part she couldn't fix with a shovel before sunrise. He was a smart boy and a watchful one, and he'd started coming home from the creek, where he and Daniel went some afternoons, the creek having recovered slightly from the drought, with a quietness that she recognized, the quietness of a child who's been said something to and is trying to decide whether to tell his mother. She didn't push him. She waited. It was about 3 weeks into September that he came in from town. She'd sent him and Daniel with a small list, flour and salt and thread, things she needed, giving them the money and trusting Eli to handle the transaction. And Daniel ran ahead with the purchases and Eli came in behind, and she could see it on his face before he said a word. "What happened?" she said. He put his hat on the peg by the door, a habit she'd been working on with him for months, automatic now. He looked at the floor and then at her. "Rory Prentice said Pa left because you drove him off," Eli said. He said you had a bad temper, and that's why we don't have a father anymore." Martha kept her hands still on the bread she was kneading. "And what did you say?" "I said he was wrong." "Good. And then I said his mother was a gossip, who didn't have anything useful to do with her time." Martha looked at him. There was a long pause. "Eli, he started it." "That's true," she said. "And also, you can't say that to people." "Why not?" "It's true. Because." She stopped. She thought about it. She wanted to give him a real answer, not just because I said so, which was the kind of answer that taught children nothing. Because when you say something like that, even if it's true, it gives them a reason to be angry at us instead of thinking about whether they're wrong. You win the argument and you lose the point. Eli looked at her. He was 9 years old and he was thinking about this with the same focus she'd seen him give to the smokehouse, to the fence post, to everything Silas taught him that he decided was worth understanding. That doesn't seem fair, he said. It's not, she said. It's just how it works. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, Mama, why do they hate us? She stopped kneading. She turned to face him fully. It wasn't a dramatic question the way he asked it. He wasn't crying, he was just tired. 9 years old and tired of it. Tired of the things she'd been trying to protect him from noticing and hadn't, because he was too smart to not notice. They don't hate us, she said. They're uncomfortable. That's different. What's the difference? Hatred takes energy, she said. What these people have is they've decided we're a problem they'd rather not think about. If they help us, they have to think about us. If they pick a side, they have to commit to it. It's easier to look away. She looked at her son. That's not our fault. That's theirs. He thought about it. Does it stop? At some point? She wanted to tell him yes. She wanted to give him that. But she thought about the Teague family and their 40 acres, and a man dead in the winter after, and a woman who'd taken her children east, and she thought about what it cost to raise a child on lies they'd have to unlearn later. I don't know, she said. I think it can. I think people can surprise you. She paused. Some of them. He nodded, like that was a real enough answer. He went to find Daniel, and Martha turned back to her bread, and she kept her hands moving, and she did not let herself think about Robert Hale, who had left 2 boys behind who deserved much better than what they'd gotten, who was out there somewhere doing whatever he was doing while his sons were learning, at ages 9 and 6, about the economics of human cowardice. She pressed the bread hard enough that Silas, passing the window outside, glanced in to check what was happening. The first week of October was when Cartwright came up from Bandera. He arrived on a Wednesday, driving his own buggy, and he brought with him a leather case full of documents, and also, unexpectedly, a man Martha had not met before. Horace Beale. She'd heard the name from Cartwright in Bandera, the third family still fighting, and here he was, a tall, weathered man in his late 50s, raw-boned and deliberate in his movements, with a scar along his left jaw that had the old silver look of something healed a long time ago. He had the particular dignity of a man who'd been through something that had cost him considerably and was still standing. They sat at Martha's table, the 4 of them, her, Silas, Cartwright, Beale, and Cartwright laid out what he'd found. It was worse than she'd known. Not just her property, not just Beale's. Over the course of 14 months of research, Cartwright had identified 6 families who had received letters from Pollard about manufactured boundary disputes. 2 had already sold under pressure. 1 had simply left, abandoned the property, which Mercer had then acquired through a county lien process for unpaid taxes, a process that Cartwright was fairly certain Mercer had manipulated. 1 family was fighting, running out of money, and the remaining 2 were Martha and Beale. He's not doing this randomly, Cartwright said. Every one of these properties sits on or adjacent to the proposed freight road corridor. I've gotten hold of the original route survey. It was commissioned by Mercer himself, which tells you something. Every parcel he's targeted sits within 100 feet of the corridor center line. And the county recorder? Silas asked. A man named Dupree, Cartwright said. I believe he's been paid. I can't prove it yet, but the speed with which certain documents have been processed, and certain others seem to have been misplaced, is not consistent with ordinary incompetence. Horace Beale made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Ordinary incompetence takes longer, he said. His voice was deep and slow, a voice that didn't use more words than it needed. Dupree's been losing my paperwork for a year, too consistent to be an accident. Agreed, Cartwright said, which brings us to the question of what to do about it. He looked at Martha. Filing the preemptive challenge to your boundary survey is still the right first move. That protects your land in the immediate term. But if we want to actually stop him for the families who've already lost and for any family he targets next, we need to build the corruption case. That means documenting the pattern, getting affidavits from the families who've already sold, finding someone inside Mercer's operation who's willing to talk. That last part, Silas said. Cartwright looked at him. Yes. I might know someone, Silas said. He said it the way he said things. Plain, no particular weight on it. But Martha looked at him and saw something that she hadn't seen in his face before. Something that had teeth. "Who?" she asked. "A man named Cord Pickett. He's worked on Mercer's spread for about 6 years, handles a lot of the business arrangements. He and Mercer had a falling out a few months back. I heard about it through someone else. Pickett left the spread. I don't know where he went." He paused. "If he's willing to talk, he knows everything. He was in the room for all of it." "Can you find him?" Cartwright asked. "I can try." Martha watched this exchange and thought about what Silas's life must have looked like before he showed up at her door. The people he knew, the things he'd been tracking, the fact that he knew about Cord Pickett and Cord Pickett's falling out with Gideon Mercer. She thought about how he'd said, "I knew a family," when he was talking about the Teagues, and how he hadn't said, "I tried to help them," the way someone would say it if it was a casual involvement. He'd said it like someone who'd been in it and been marked by it. "All right," she said. "Let's do all of it. The challenge on the survey, the affidavits, Pickett, if you can find him." She looked at Beale. "I want to talk to the other families too, the ones who've already sold." Beale looked at her steadily. "Some of them won't want to talk. They've moved on. Looking back costs them something." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, once. "I'll go with you," he said. "They know me." But through October, they built the case piece by piece, the way you built anything that had to hold under pressure, so carefully, without rushing, checking each part before you put weight on it. Cartwright filed the survey challenge in the second week of October, which bought time and which, Martha noticed, produced an almost immediate change in the temperature from Mercer's direction. The pleasant, patient pressure didn't stop, but it got quieter, like a man recalculating. She took that as evidence they were doing the right thing. She and Beale drove out together twice to visit the families who'd sold. The first visit was to a couple named Garner, Roy and Ada, now living in a small rented house on the edge of Bandera, Roy working at the feed mill. They were in their 40s, tired looking, Ada with a wariness in her eyes that Martha recognized as the look of people who'd been through something and were still waiting for the next bad thing. Roy didn't want to talk. He said it was over and done and he didn't see the point of going back into it. Ada said, "Roy, look at her." Roy looked at Martha. "She's still there," Ada said. "On the land. She's still fighting." Roy was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you need?" The second family, the Weatherbys, was harder. Walt Weatherby had already drunk most of whatever money Mercer had paid him for the land, and his wife had left him, and he was living alone in a rooming house in Kerrville, looking like a man who'd made peace with the wrong set of things. He was not interested in affidavits or court proceedings or any of it. He told Martha she was wasting her time and that Mercer always won and that she'd find out the way he'd found out. "He wins because people decide he's going to win," Martha said. She wasn't angry, just tired. "Before the fight even starts. He wins because he has money and judges," Walt said. "Philosophy doesn't change that." She didn't have an answer for him that would have been honest. She thanked him, and she and Beale drove back to the road, and she sat in the wagon for a moment before picking up the reins. "Not everyone comes with you," Beale said. "I know." She flicked the reins. "Doesn't mean you stop asking." Silas found Cord Pickett in the second week of October, in a town called Uvalde, working at a freight warehouse. He'd ridden 3 days each way to find him and came back looking tired and trail-dusted, and like he'd been thinking hard for 6 days. He told her about it in the kitchen after the boys were asleep. He'd found Pickett. Pickett was willing to talk, but not to a lawyer, not yet. He wanted to know there was something solid before he committed to anything. He'd been with Mercer for 6 years, and he knew what Mercer did to people who crossed him, and he was still afraid enough that the fear was visible on him, even to someone describing him secondhand. "What does he know?" Martha asked. "He knows about Dupree," Silas said. "He knows about the payments. He was there when the arrangement was made. He also knows about a judge in Fredericksburg named Harlan. Mercer has been routing certain cases to Harlan's court for years. There's a reason those cases go the way they go." Martha sat with that. A corrupt recorder and a corrupt judge. The infrastructure of the thing, the way it all held together. "Pickett will testify to this? If he thinks it's going to matter. If he thinks someone's actually going to win." Silas looked at her. "He said he'd been waiting for someone to build a case big enough that Mercer couldn't bury it. Small cases he can make disappear. Something this broad in a district court, with multiple families and a documented pattern. He paused. That's different. Can you go back to him after we have the Garner affidavit? Yes. Then that's the next step. She looked at the lamp on the table, the small circle of light it put on the wood. When did you know all of this? About Dupree? About the judge? He was quiet for a moment. I've known pieces of it for a while. 2 years, maybe. The Teague situation. After it happened, I started asking questions. Not for any particular reason at first, just because I wanted to understand how it had been done. And you didn't have enough. I had suspicions. Suspicions aren't anything. He looked at his hands. What I didn't have was someone to build the case around. The families who'd been hurt were gone or broken. There wasn't a center to it. He looked up at her. You're the center. Your property's the clearest case. Your documentation is clean. Cartwright's right that you're the strongest anchor for all of it. She looked at him. My father's letter, she said. He knew something was coming. He didn't know the details. I don't think he knew about Dupree or the judge. But he knew about the freight road, and he knew where your land sat, and he knew Mercer. Silas paused. He was a smart man. He was, she said quietly. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the October night was cooling fast. The first real edge of fall in the air, and the sky was clear and enormous above the ridge with a moon just past full, making the yard pale and silver. The chickens were quiet. The barn was dark. Everything looked from this window the way it was supposed to look, like a place where people lived and worked and were going to keep doing both of those things. She intended to keep it looking that way. The stand at the Saturday market had grown into something she hadn't entirely planned. She'd started bringing more, not just smoked pork, but beans she'd cooked down with the pork fat, and cornbread she made in the Dutch oven in the smokehouse while the meat was running. Simple things. But people had started coming specifically for it. A rancher's hand who worked 12 miles north made a point of coming through Caldwell Crossing on Saturdays now because, as he apparently told someone, it was the best food inside of 30 miles. She'd started keeping a small sign, just her name and smoked meats and provisions. Nothing fancy. Claire Prentice walked past it once with a look on her face like she'd smelled something bad. Martha watched her go and felt nothing in particular about it, which she recognized as progress. What she didn't expect, what she genuinely could not have predicted, was the morning of the second Saturday in October when she arrived to find that Ben Holloway had put a small handwritten sign in his hardware store window. It said, Martha Hale's Smoked Meats, best in the county, Saturdays on the main road. She stood in front of his window for a long moment, then she went inside. He was behind the counter arranging something in a display case. He looked up when she came in, and then looked quickly back down at what he was doing. Ben, she said. Morning, Mrs. Hale. The sign. He fiddled with whatever was in the case. My wife's been buying from you for 3 weeks. She says I'm an idiot for not saying so out loud. He paused. She's usually right about things like that. Martha looked at him. He was a square-built, ordinary man with a decent face and the slightly apologetic look of someone who knows they've been slow to do the right thing. Thank you, she said. It's nothing, he said. It's not nothing, she said. But all right. She went back to her table and set up for the day, and she thought about how things moved in a town this size, how one sign in a window could shift something microscopically in the way people weighed their choices. Not a revolution, not even a real change, not yet. Just one small stone moved slightly in a different direction. She sold out in 90 minutes, packed up and drove home, and was halfway down the creek road when she smelled the smoke. She smelled it before she saw it. The wind was out of the south, carrying it toward her, and her first thought, her body's thought, before her mind caught up, was smokehouse. The smokehouse fire got too high, but she'd banked it properly the evening before. She was sure of it. She was meticulous about it. She came around the long curve in the road and saw the orange against the gray October sky. Not the smokehouse, the roadside stand. The small wooden structure she'd built with Silas and Eli over 2 weekends in September. 4 posts and a roof and a counter, set back from the road just far enough not to block traffic, but close enough to be visible. It was burning. Or rather, it had burned. What she was seeing was the end of it, the black skeleton of the post still standing, the roof entirely gone, sparks still drifting up in the afternoon air like orange snow. She pulled the horse up. She sat in the wagon and looked at it. She didn't get down immediately. She just looked. The way you look at something when you need a moment to understand what you're seeing before you can begin to react to it. The stand was gone. She'd built it from lumber she'd bought with money from the market sales, real money earned and spent carefully, and it was gone. There was nothing to salvage. The posts might be pulled and reused if they hadn't burned too deep, but everything else, the counter, the storage shelf underneath, the small wooden box she'd used as a cash box, the 2 extra wooden signs she'd painted herself by lamplight, all of it was black ash and nothing. She got down from the wagon. The ground around the base of the posts was scorched in a pattern that didn't make sense for an accidental fire. She didn't know a great deal about how fires started, but she knew something about where they started and how they moved, and this fire had started at multiple points simultaneously. She could see it in the way the scorch marks radiated. This wasn't a spark from the road, not a coal that fell from a passing wagon. This was deliberate. She stood in front of what was left of it, and something moved through her that was not exactly anger and not exactly despair and not exactly fear. It was all three, layered, and underneath all three of them something harder and quieter that she didn't quite have a word for. She heard the wagon coming before she saw it. Silas, driving down from the cabin with the boys in the back. He must have seen the smoke from the property. She watched them come, watched Silas pull up and look at what was left of the stand with a face that gave nothing away except, if you knew where to look, a jaw set a fraction tighter than usual. Eli and Daniel were both very quiet in the wagon bed. "Mama," Daniel said, very small. "It's all right," she said. The words were automatic. "It's not all right," Eli said. He wasn't being argumentative. He was just stating a fact, in the flat, careful way of someone who's decided that calling things what they are matters more than being comforted. He looked at the stand. He looked at his mother. "Who did this?" "We don't know for certain," Martha said. "We know," Eli said. He looked at Silas. "Don't we?" Silas said nothing for a moment. Then he climbed down from the wagon. He walked around the perimeter of the burned stand the way Martha had, looking at the scorch marks, and she watched him think about what he was seeing. When he straightened up, he looked at Martha, not at Eli. "Yes," he said, not to Eli, to her. To the question behind Eli's question. "We know." Eli got down from the wagon without being told. He walked to one of the standing posts and put his hand on it and looked at the blackened wood. There was something in his face that Martha had never seen there before, something that had moved past boyhood without asking permission, something bleak and old and furious in a way that 9-year-old boys shouldn't have to know yet. "Eli," she said. He didn't look at her. He kept looking at the post. "Eli, look at me." He turned. His eyes were dry, which was almost worse. "This is not over," she said. "This is not the end of anything. Do you hear me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "He burned it down," he said. We built that. We built that, and he..." He stopped. He was fighting something. Why doesn't anyone stop him? Why does everyone just let him do whatever he... "Because people are afraid," Martha said, "and because it's easier, and because they haven't been given a reason to stop being afraid yet. So what do we do?" She looked at her son. She looked at the ashes. She thought about Cartwright and the affidavits and Cord Pickett and Uvalde, and a pattern that stretched across 6 families in this county, and a corrupt recorder and a corrupt judge, and a man who had been running this particular machinery for long enough that he believed it was permanent. "We give them a reason," she said. Daniel, who had been very still in the wagon during all of this, leaned over the side and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be brave, "Are we going to have to leave? Like before? When other people had to leave?" Martha looked at her younger son. He was 6 years old, and he was asking the right question, which made her heart do something complicated in her chest. "No," she said. "We are not leaving." "You promise?" She had made a personal rule in the months since Robert left about promising things she wasn't certain of. She'd broken that rule a few times, and she'd regretted it. But she looked at Daniel's face, and she thought about what it cost him to ask that question, and she thought about what it would cost him if she hedged. "I promise," she said. The town heard about the fire, the way the town heard about everything, and for 2 days nothing visible happened. People talked. She knew they were talking because she could feel it when she went to Holloway's for nails. The texture of the silence slightly different than usual, charged with something she couldn't entirely read. On the third day, a Wednesday, she was in town getting the nails and a length of rope when she came out of the hardware store to find Louise Ferris standing on the boardwalk with 3 other women she knew slightly. Nell Abrams, whose husband ran the mill, a younger woman named Patricia Keel, whose family had come out from Georgia 2 years ago and hadn't entirely found their place in the town's established order, and Vera Drummond, the old woman who had publicly called the spoiled meat rumor a lie. They were standing together in a way that had a slightly deliberate quality to it, like people who'd decided to be somewhere rather than just ended up there. "Mrs. Hale," Louise said. "Louise," Martha looked at the group. "Ladies, we'd like to help you rebuild," Vera Drummond said. She said it the way she'd said the smoked meat wasn't spoiled, plainly, with the brusqueness of someone who'd decided and was done discussing the decision. "Bill Ferris and my son will bring lumber Saturday morning. Nell's husband says the mill will cut it at cost. I'll bring food for the work party, and I expect Patricia will help me." Martha looked at them. "That's—" She stopped. She'd been about to say "that's not necessary," which was the thing you said when you were proud and uncomfortable with help, and hadn't entirely learned the difference between accepting help and surrendering to weakness. She made herself not say it. "Thank you," she said instead. "That means a great deal." Vera Drummond waved her hand like the thanks was unnecessary and vaguely annoying. "Don't make a thing of it. Someone burned down your stand and it's a disgrace, and something should be done about it." She looked at Martha with sharp, assessing eyes. "Word is you have a lawyer working on the land business." "That's right." "Good." Vera said it like a period. "You let people know if there's anything else you need." She looked at the other women, apparently finished, and walked away with the particular authority of someone who doesn't need a group to depart from. Louise stayed a moment. "She's been talking to people," she said quietly. "Vera, about what Mercer's been doing. She remembers the Teague family. She was one of the people who looked the other way then, and I think—" She stopped. "I think she's been carrying that for a while." Martha thought about Eli asking, "Why does everyone just let him do whatever he wants?" and the answer she'd given about people who hadn't been given a reason yet. She looked at the direction Vera Drummond had gone and thought about a 60-something widow who'd looked away once and had apparently decided she was done doing that. "Saturday," she said. "Tell Bill and your son that I'll have coffee and cornbread ready." Saturday morning, 6 people showed up with lumber. She hadn't expected 6. She'd expected 3 or 4. Louise, Bill, Vera's son. But Horace Beale had ridden in from his spread for it, which she hadn't known he was going to do. Ben Holloway came with a box of nails and his own hammer. And to Martha's genuine surprise, a man named Ellis Cutter, who worked at the livery, and whom she'd always assumed was in Mercer's corner, because he'd always been in Mercer's corner about everything, as far as she could tell, showed up with a saw and a thermos of coffee and no explanation. She caught his eye at one point and he just shrugged. "Man burns down a woman's business," he said. "You start wondering what else he's capable of." He went back to measuring. The new stand went up in 5 hours. It was better than the first one, wider, with a deeper overhang for weather. And Horace Beale had brought cedar posts rather than pine, which would last longer and didn't mind the smoke. Silas and Eli worked alongside everyone else. And at some point in the middle of the morning, Martha found herself standing back watching a dozen people working on a structure on her behalf, and she had to turn away for a moment and look at the road, because she didn't want any of them to see her face. She heard a small sound beside her. Daniel, who'd been hovering at the edges of the work all morning, had come to stand next to her. He slipped his hand into hers without looking at her, looking at the people working, like it was the most natural thing. She held on. They stood there together for a while, the 6-year-old and his mother, watching something get built out of the remains of something that had been destroyed, in a town that was maybe, slowly, beginning to remember that it had a choice about what kind of place it was going to be. Not a revolution. She knew better than that. This was a Saturday morning work party, not a verdict. Mercer was still there. The lawyer in Fredericksburg was still there. Dupree was still at the county recorder's office, and Cord Pickett was still in Uvalde working at a freight warehouse, and a lot of things were still unsettled and unfinished. But the stand was going up, and people she'd written off as permanently turned away were here with hammers and nails, and Vera Drummond was moving through the group with a tin coffee pot like she was running a field operation. And somewhere in the county, there were 6 families who'd been hurt by the same man, and for the first time in years, there was a possibility, not a certainty, not yet, but a possibility, that someone was actually going to do something about it. Eli appeared at her other side. He didn't take her hand. He was 9 and too old for that, supposedly. But he stood close enough that his shoulder was against her arm. "It's going to be bigger than the first one," he said. He was looking at the frame going up. "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking. "Mama," he said, "earlier, when you promised Daniel we weren't leaving." "Yeah, I know you don't usually make promises when you're not sure," he said. "I've noticed that." She looked at him. "So," he said carefully, "does that mean you're sure?" She looked at the cedar posts going into the ground, at Horace Beale driving the post pounder with the focused efficiency of a man who'd been doing physical labor his whole life, at Ben Holloway measuring a board for the counter with his tongue between his teeth, at Silas fitting a cross brace with the quiet competence he brought to everything. She thought about Cartwright's leather case full of documents. She thought about the Garner affidavit and Roy's face when Ada had said, "Look at her." She thought about Cord Pickett in Uvalde and what he knew and what it would mean when he finally said it out loud to someone with the power to act on it. She thought about her father writing a letter he knew he might not live to see answered. "I'm working on being sure," she said. "That's the best I can do." Eli thought about it. "That's enough," he said. He went back to help with the framing, and Martha stood in the October sun with the smell of fresh-cut cedar in the air and the sound of hammers around her, and the knowledge that the road ahead was still long, and that the man who'd burned her stand was still powerful, and that justice was a slow, uncertain, expensive thing that required more of you than was fair to ask. And she went to work. Cord Pickett arrived in Caldwell Crossing on a Thursday in late October, riding a borrowed horse, and looking like a man who'd spent the previous week talking himself in and out of the same decision multiple times. He was thinner than Silas had described, with a nervous, watchful quality about him, the kind of man who checked doorways when he came into a room, not because he was dangerous, but because he'd learned to be careful around people who were. He had a good face underneath the nerves, the face of someone who'd been involved in things he wasn't proud of and had the self-awareness to know it. Silas had arranged for him to come to the cabin rather than into town, which Martha agreed was the right call. Whatever Pickett knew, she didn't want it talked about on the main street before it was ready to be talked about in a courtroom. They sat at the kitchen table, her, Silas, Pickett, and Cartwright, who'd ridden up from Bandera the day before specifically for this, and Martha made coffee and put it on the table and sat down and let Cartwright ask the first questions because he knew what he needed and she didn't want to waste time. Pickett talked for 2 hours. He talked about Dupree at the county recorder's office, the specific amounts, the specific dates, the specific documents that had been altered or delayed or quietly misfiled. He named the first payment at $40, which seemed almost insultingly small for what it had bought, and described the arrangement growing from there until Dupree was essentially a contractor for Mercer's legal operations, available on request. He talked about Judge Harlan in Fredericksburg, the hunting trips, the particular kind of arrangement that never involved money changing hands directly, but always involved something of equal or greater value moving in the right direction. He talked about the private survey that Pollard had filed on Martha's land, who'd commissioned it, who'd conducted it, how the surveyor had been told what result was needed before he'd walked a single foot of ground. And he talked about the fire. Martha had known it was deliberate. She'd seen the scorch pattern. But there was a difference between knowing something and having a man sit at your kitchen table and confirm it with names and dates. Pickett said he hadn't been there himself. He'd left Mercer's operation 2 months before the fire. But he knew who had been sent. A man named Drayden who handled what Pickett called the physical problems, meaning the things Mercer needed done that couldn't be connected to him through paper. He didn't know where Drayden was now. "Will you put this in writing?" Cartwright asked. "An affidavit, signed and sworn." Pickett looked at his hands. He'd been looking at his hands at intervals throughout the 2 hours, the way a person does when what they're saying weighs something. "If I do that,"
he said. Mercer finds out. Eventually, yes, Cartwright said. That's unavoidable. And then I've got a problem.
You have a problem, Cartwright agreed. The alternative is that he continues what he's doing and the people he's done it to have no remedy. Pickett was quiet. Martha watched him sitting there with the weight of it on his face, the genuine complexity of a man who'd been part of something wrong and was now being asked to pay a price for setting it right. She thought about Walt Weatherby in the rooming house in Kerrville, who decided that accommodation was easier. She thought about what it had cost him. Cord, Silas said. He'd been quiet for most of the 2 hours. When he said the name, Pickett looked at him, and something passed between them. The particular look of men who've known each other through difficult circumstances. You already made the decision when you rode here. You know you did. Pickett looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he said quietly, I'll need somewhere safe to stay while this works through the courts. I'll arrange it, Cartwright said. All right, Pickett said. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. All right, let's do it. The affidavit took most of the following day to complete properly. Cartwright was meticulous about it. Every claim sourced, every date verified against whatever Pickett could produce to support it, every name spelled correctly, and every amount confirmed. Martha sat in the room for parts of it and left for other parts, tending the smokehouse, checking on the boys, doing the ordinary work of the day because it needed doing and because sitting in a room listening to the documented architecture of a man's cruelty for 8 hours without a break would have hollowed her out. At one point, she was at the smokehouse and Eli came out to help her check the fire, and they stood together in the October cold with their breath making small clouds and the smell of hickory smoke around them. And she told him, in broad terms, what was happening inside. So this is the proof? He said. Part of it. The biggest part. He nodded slowly. He was at an age where he was starting to understand that the world had mechanisms, that things didn't just happen or not happen, that there were specific gears and levers, and that knowing how they worked was different from being at their mercy. She watched him processing this. And then what? After Cartwright has the proof? He files it with the district court. There's a hearing. The judge looks at the evidence. What if the judge is one of Mercer's judges? She looked at her son. He had thought of something that Cartwright had already addressed, but that still sat uneasily in her chest. Cartwright is filing in the district court in San Antonio. Different jurisdiction. Mercer doesn't have the same reach there. She paused. We think. You think. Nothing in this is certain, Eli. You know that. He did know it. That was one of the things she'd stopped being able to protect him from. The knowledge that the right outcome wasn't guaranteed, that doing the correct thing and winning weren't the same thing and never had been. She hated that he knew this at 9 years old. She also thought, in her more honest moments, that it was better to know it than not. But we have a real chance, she said, a real one. That's more than we had in August. He looked at the smoke drifting from the top of the smokehouse, and he thought about it in that particular way he had, turning it over. That's enough to keep going, he said finally. It was almost exactly what she'd said to him when he'd asked if she was sure. She didn't point that out. Cartwright left for San Antonio on Monday with Pickett's affidavit, the Garner affidavit, his own documentation of the pattern across the 6 families, the survey challenge he'd already filed, and the original Hale deed in a leather case that he'd triple-checked was latched before he put it in his saddlebag. He was also carrying letters from Horace Beale and, after some persuasion, from Roy Garner, not sworn affidavits but supporting statements, personal accounts of the pressure they'd been put under, signed in both cases by men who had nothing obvious to gain from signing them. Watching him ride south from the end of her track, Martha felt a particular kind of emptiness that wasn't quite fear, more like the feeling of having done everything you can and then having to wait while the outcome decides itself without you. She'd spent her whole adult life in motion, doing the next thing and the thing after that, and the waiting was harder than any of it. Silas came to stand beside her. How long? She asked. Cartwright said 4 to 6 weeks before the court schedules a preliminary hearing. Could be longer depending on the docket. 4 to 6 weeks. She did the quiet math of what she could build and what she could protect in that time, and whether it would be enough. Mercer's going to know, she said. Once the filing lands in San Antonio, he'll have someone watching the court records. Yes. So what does he do? Silas was quiet for a moment. He'll try to pressure someone into pulling back. The Garners, maybe. Roy was already reluctant. If he can get one of the affidavits withdrawn, it weakens the pattern evidence. What about Pickett? Pickett's the one I'm worried about, Silas said. He's the inside witness. If Mercer finds him before the hearing, he stopped. Cartwright's got him somewhere safe, but somewhere safe has limits. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the road south, his face carrying that particular weight she'd learned to associate with him thinking about things that had already gone wrong before, things he'd been close to and hadn't been able to stop. You're thinking about the Teagues, she said. He didn't deny it. I told Aaron Teague they had a real chance too, he said. About 4 months before they lost the land. He paused. He believed me. He built his case the way I told him to build it. Cartwright wasn't involved then. I found a different lawyer, less thorough, and the judge was Harlan. This isn't Harlan. No, but she understood the but. The but was the gap between doing everything right and getting the right result. The gap that the world didn't close just because you wanted it to. She'd been living inside that gap for most of her life. You didn't get to close it by believing hard enough, and you didn't get to ignore it by pretending it wasn't there. You just had to keep going anyway and see what happened. We'll protect Pickett as best we can, she said, and we'll keep building the public case. If Mercer tries to pressure the Garners, we find out about it and we bring it to Cartwright. We document everything. She looked at the road. And we wait. Silas looked at her for a moment. You're better at this than you think, he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm doing the only thing I can think of, she said. That's not the same as being good at it. She was right that Mercer moved fast. The first indication came from Louise Ferris, who came by on a Wednesday with a look on her face that meant news she'd been debating how to deliver. She told Martha that Roy Garner had been visited at the feed mill in Bandera by 2 men she didn't know the names of, who'd spent about 40 minutes with him and left him looking, by all accounts, shaken. Ada came to see me, Louise said. She's frightened. Roy won't tell her what was said, but she could see it on him. Martha went still. She thought about Roy Garner's face when Ada had said, look at her. A man who'd already been broken once by this same machinery. A man who'd agreed to do the right thing partly because she'd been sitting across from him in his rented house and he'd felt something in the moment and signed his name to a piece of paper. But feelings in a moment and a piece of paper had limits when men with no names came and sat across from you at work and said things that didn't need to be explicit to be clear. Can you get to Ada? Martha asked, before Roy makes a decision. I can try, Louise said. But Martha, what do you say to someone who's already had everything taken from them once? What's the argument? Martha thought about it. It was a real question, not rhetorical, a genuine one, and it deserved a real answer. You tell her that the paper Roy signed isn't just protecting me, she said. It's protecting the next family, the one Mercer targets after me if he wins. There's always a next family. She paused. That's not nothing. That might not be enough for Roy, but it's not nothing. Louise nodded slowly. I'll go tomorrow. The second pressure point came from a direction Martha hadn't anticipated. Pete Cawley at the livery, Ellis Cutter's coworker, the one who'd passed along the spoiled meat rumor, came to find Silas one morning while Martha was running the smokehouse. He had the look of a man delivering a message he'd been paid to deliver and wasn't comfortable with. He told Silas that there were people in town saying Silas Creed had a history, that he'd been involved in a land dispute up in Medina County 3 years ago that had gone badly, that a man had been hurt badly enough to require a doctor, and that Silas had left the county the following week under circumstances that were not entirely explained. Silas listened to this without expression. When Cawley finished, he thanked him for telling him, and Cawley left. Martha, who had come back from the smokehouse in time to catch the end of the conversation, stood in the yard and looked at Silas. Is it true? She asked. Most of it, he said. He was looking at the ground, his hands in his pockets. He had the look of a man who'd expected this to come up eventually, and still wasn't entirely ready for it. Tell me. He looked up. He looked at her face, reading something in it. Whether she was going to wait, whether she was going to panic, whether the ground between them could hold what he was about to put on it. There was a land dispute in Medina County, he said, 3 years ago. I was helping a family, the Aldermans, German family, good people. A man named Braxton was doing to them a version of what Mercer does, though smaller, local. I found evidence Braxton had paid someone to falsify a water rights document. He paused. Braxton came to the alderman's property one night with 2 men. I was there. It got physical. One of Braxton's men ended up with a broken arm and some broken ribs. He paused again. I didn't leave because I was afraid of the law. I left because Braxton dropped the dispute after that, and the aldermans were safe, and my being there was still creating risk for them as long as I stayed. Martha looked at him. She thought about the way he'd sat at her table and read Mercer's legal letter and said I might know someone, the way he'd ridden 3 days each way to find Cord Pickett, the way he'd taught Eli how to read smoke and how to check a fence post for rot and how to hold a hammer so your elbow didn't give out. Did the aldermans keep their land? She asked. Yes. And the man with the broken arm, was he doing something that warranted it? Silas looked at her. He had a rifle on an elderly man, he said flatly. She nodded once. Then I'm not concerned about it. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she'd seen there before, that quiet, careful wait, like a man who'd gotten used to being judged by the worst version of a story. Mercer's using it to discredit you, she said. With the people in town who are starting to come around, if he can make you look unstable or criminal. He undermines the case by association, Silas said. Yes, I know. So we need to control the story. She thought about it. Cartwright needs to know about Medina County before someone else brings it up in a courtroom. I'll write to him today. Good. She looked at him. Silas, I need to ask you something directly. All right. Is there anything else? Anything that would come up? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone hiding something. She'd learned the difference. The quiet of someone doing an honest accounting. No, he said. There's nothing else. All right, she said. She went back to the smokehouse. The site. The weeks between Cartwright's departure and the court date were the longest of that year. Martha worked. She kept the smokehouse running, kept the stand operational. The new cedar stand that smelled clean and held steady in the wind, kept the boys fed and clothed and as close to ordinary as she could manage, which was not always as close as she wanted. She and Horace Beale exchanged letters once a week, comparing notes on what each of them was seeing, whether Mercer's people had made any new moves on either property. He had a dry, direct way of writing that she appreciated. No false reassurance, no extra words. She also spent 2 evenings with Vera Drummond. The first evening was at Vera's house in town, a small, neat place that looked exactly like what it was. The house of a woman who'd been alone for a long time and had made a deliberate peace with it. Vera made tea without asking if Martha wanted any and set it on the table and looked at her with those sharp eyes and said, "Tell me what you actually need from people in this town, not what you're afraid to ask for." Martha looked at her. "I need people to say publicly what they know about how Mercer operates, not necessarily in court, just in the county, in conversation. Enough that when the district court takes this up, there's already a public understanding of what he's done. Judges care about that, even when they pretend they don't." Vera looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you're asking me to do." "I know. I'm not a young woman. I don't have a husband to put between me and whatever he decides to do about it." "I know that too," Martha said. She didn't add anything to it, didn't soften it, didn't offer reassurance she wasn't certain of. She just sat with it and let Vera sit with it. After a moment, Vera said, "I looked the other way with the Teague family. Did you know that? Sarah Teague came to me before the end when they were clearly going to lose, and she asked me to speak to the county commissioner. He was a friend of my husband's, on their behalf. I told her I didn't think I could make a difference." She paused. "I was lying. I was just afraid." She picked up her tea. "I think about Sarah Teague more often than is comfortable." Martha didn't say anything. "All right," Vera said. "Tell me what you need people to say." The second evening, they spent drafting it together, a letter to be circulated among the established families in the county, laying out the pattern of Mercer's land acquisitions in plain language, calling it what it was, and asking anyone with direct knowledge to come forward to Cartwright. Not an accusation, legally. Vera was sharp enough to know where that line was. Just a statement of facts and an invitation. Signed by Vera Drummond, which meant something in this county because of who her husband had been, and countersigned by Louise Ferris and Nell Abrams, and after some persuasion, Ben Holloway. "He's going to come after you for this," Martha said, looking at Vera's signature on the draft. "He's going to try," Vera said. "He's been doing one version or another of that for 20 years, and I've been here the whole time." She capped the inkwell. "I'm 64 years old, Mrs. Hale. I'm done waiting for a better moment." The letter went out in the second week of November, and 3 days later, Mercer filed a counter-motion in the district court challenging the validity of Cartwright's survey challenge on procedural grounds. Cartwright wrote to tell Martha about it and to tell her not to worry, which she took with a measured grain of salt, but his reasoning was sound. The counter-motion was weak, a delaying tactic rather than a substantive legal argument, and it told him that Mercer was rattled enough to reach for a poor tool. What he didn't write was that the same week the letter went out, Roy Garner's name was removed from the supporting documents at Roy's request. He found out from Ada Garner directly, who wrote to Martha herself. A short, painful letter that smelled faintly of the same cheap soap Martha had noticed in their rented house in Bandera. She said Roy hadn't been able to hold it, that the men who'd visited him at the mill had said things she wouldn't put in a letter, but that had landed somewhere that his courage couldn't hold them, that she was sorry, that she was angry at Roy, and she was angry at herself for not being enough, and she was angry at the whole thing for requiring more of ordinary people than ordinary people had been built to give. Martha read the letter twice and then sat with it. She was angry. She was not at Ada, not at Roy, not really. She was angry at the geometry of it, the way Mercer's power worked by finding the places and people where fear lived and applying pressure exactly there, the way a man who'd already been ground down once was easier to grind down a second time. It was efficient, and it was brutal, and it worked. And she was angry at the part of herself that had let herself believe Roy Garner's signature meant more than it could sustain. She wrote Ada back. She said she understood. She said she wasn't angry at Roy, and she meant it, mostly. She said the case was still moving and that the Garner family's story was still part of it, even without Roy's name on paper. She told Silas about it that evening, and he listened without trying to fix it, which was the right response. He'd learned that about her, that sometimes she needed to say the thing out loud and have it heard, not solved. "We still have Beale," he said when she'd finished. "We still have Beale. And Pickett. Pickett is the one that matters most in court. Is he still—" "Last I heard from Cartwright, yes. He's holding." She nodded. She looked at the fire in the hearth. She'd started keeping a fire in the evenings now, November getting cold enough to need it. "I want to go to San Antonio," she said, "for the hearing. Cartwright will expect you." "I know, but I want to go for myself too. I want to be in the room." She looked at him. "I've been letting this happen around me for weeks. People moving pieces, Cartwright filing things, you finding people, the letters going out. I want to be in the room where it happens." "You should be," he said. "You're the lead plaintiff." "I know I'm the lead plaintiff. I want to be there as me." She paused. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "There is." The hearing was set for the first week of December. Cartwright's letter came in mid-November with the date and the courtroom and a list of what to bring, and also a note at the end separate from the legal instructions that said simply, "The judge assigned is Marcus Webb. He is honest. I have appeared before him 3 times and lost twice, which is how I know." Martha read that last line twice and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. She spent the 2 weeks before the hearing doing what she could do and letting go of what she couldn't. She kept the smokehouse running because stopping would have meant letting fear make decisions, and she wasn't going to do that. She wrote to Horace Beale about logistics. They'd traveled to San Antonio together, which made practical sense and also meant neither of them would be doing it alone. She made arrangements for Louise Ferris to look after the boys, which the boys received with mixed feelings. Daniel was excited about staying with Louise, who had a particular talent for keeping 6-year-olds entertained. Eli was old enough to understand what the trip meant, and young enough to be frightened of it, and the two things were fighting on his face the afternoon she explained it to him. "What if it goes wrong?" he asked. "Then we come back and we figure out what's next," she said. "But Cartwright thinks it won't." "What does Silas think?" She looked at her son. She thought about asking him why it mattered what Silas thought, and then she thought about who had taught him to ride better, who had taught him about fences and firewood and the difference between a load-bearing wall and one that could come down, who had listened to him talk about horses for 45 minutes once, without once looking like he wanted to be somewhere else. "Silas thinks we have a real case," she said, "and he's not a man who says things he doesn't mean." Eli seemed to accept that. He went out to help with the evening chores, and Martha stood at the kitchen window and watched him go and thought about the shape of what they'd built over these past months. Not just the stand, not just the legal case, but the thing inside the cabin, the living shape of something that had been broken and had come back together differently. Not perfectly. Not the family she'd thought she was building 7 years ago when she and Robert had come out to this land with 2 mules and a wagon full of hope. A different thing. A harder thing, maybe, with a different center of gravity. She wasn't entirely sure what to call it. She wasn't ready to name it yet. The night before they left for San Antonio, Silas found her at the smokehouse at 11 o'clock, checking the fire one last time before a long absence. He stood in the doorway with a lantern. "The Ferrises will check it," he said. "I know. I just want to look at it." She looked at the firebox, the slow, steady smoke. "My father used to say this thing. He said that whatever you can build with your hands is real in a way that arguments aren't. That you can argue yourself into or out of anything, but something you made with your hands, that sits in the world and doesn't care about your arguments." Silas stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything. "I built this smokehouse back," she said, "with your help, but I built it. And the stand, we built that twice. They burned it, and we built it again better. Whatever happens in that courtroom, that's true." She looked at him. "I keep coming back to that." He stepped inside the smokehouse and leaned against the wall. In the low light from the firebox, his face was all plains and shadow, the tiredness of the last months visible around his eyes in a way that she'd started to notice more. The way his shoulders sometimes dropped at the end of the day. The way he'd looked, a few mornings, like sleep had not been entirely cooperative. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "After this?" She paused. "What do you do? Where do you go?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think about it. Genuinely think about it, not reach for an easy answer. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't had a clear answer to that question for a while." "How long?" "A few years." He looked at the firebox. "After the Teagues, I kept moving, doing things, but it was more like not stopping than like going somewhere." She understood that more than she wanted to. "Silas, what my father knew about you, what he thought he was sending to me when he wrote that letter." She paused. "He knew you needed this too, didn't he? Not just to help us. You needed a reason to stop moving." He was very still for a moment. He looked at her sideways. "Your father," he said slowly, "was a harder man to fool than he looked." "He was," she said. She almost smiled. "I take after him." They stood in the smokehouse in the cold November night with the fire going slow and steady, and it was not a comfortable silence. Too much in it, too much acknowledged in it for comfort. But it was an honest one, and she'd come to value that above most things. "The boys are good kids," he said finally. "They are. He's going to be someone," he said. "The way he thinks. He's going to be someone worth watching." "I know," she said. The pride in it caught her slightly off guard, the clean, simple fact of it. "I know he is." "Daniel too," Silas added, "in a different way. Daniel's going to be the one who makes people feel like everything's going to be all right. The world needs people like that." She looked at him. She thought about asking him straight out what she'd been turning over for weeks. What he was to this family, what she was to him. What the shape of the thing between them was, and whether it had a name yet. She thought about it, and she didn't ask it. Not tonight, not with San Antonio tomorrow, and everything still unsettled. But she let it sit between them, acknowledged if unnamed, and that was its own kind of answer. "Get some sleep," she said. "Early start tomorrow." "You too," he said. He took his lantern and went to the barn, and she banked the smokehouse fire and went inside. They left at dawn, her, Silas, and Horace Beale, who'd ridden in the evening before and spent the night in the barn. The boys were asleep when they left, Louise having come over at first light to be there when they woke. Martha stood at the door of the sleeping room for a long moment before they left, and looked at her two sons in the rope bed, tangled together as always, breathing their even sleep. She did not wake them. She'd said her goodbyes the night before. She just looked, the way you look at something you love when you're about to do something you're not certain of. Then she picked up her bag and went to the wagon. The road to San Antonio in December was cold and long and not particularly picturesque. Dry grass, low scrub oak, the occasional limestone outcrop catching the pale winter light. They didn't talk much for the first hour. Bial had a natural quietness that matched Silas's, and Martha was in her own head going over what Cartwright had told her to say and not say, turning over the shape of the thing they'd built and whether it would hold under examination. About halfway through the first day, Bial said, "I've been doing this for 14 months. Martha looked at him. "Before you," he said. "Before Cartwright got involved. I was just trying to hold ground by myself, barely managing it." He looked at the road. "It's different with people beside you." "It is," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens, I'm glad you didn't sell. When Mercer first came at you, I heard about it, second or third hand. I thought—" He stopped. He was not a man who found personal statements easy, she'd learned. "I thought it was probably over. I thought you'd sell and I'd be alone again and eventually I'd run out of money, and that would be that." He paused. "I was wrong." She looked at the road ahead. "You weren't wrong to think it," she said. "It almost happened. There were days." She didn't finish the sentence, but he nodded like he understood it. "You've got good people around you," he said. He looked briefly at Silas, who was riding slightly ahead of the wagon. "Not everyone's that lucky." "No," she said. "They're not." San Antonio was larger than Martha had been to in years. Stone buildings and broad streets, and the smell of wood smoke and horses, and the distant sound of a city doing its business. The district courthouse was a serious-looking structure on a corner near the center of town, with high windows and a stone facade that was meant to convey permanence. It managed it. Martha stood in front of it the morning of the hearing and looked up at it and thought about how many things had been decided inside buildings like this one. How many lives had turned on what happened in a room with a judge and a set of documents, and the specific weight that truth carried on a given day. She went in. Cartwright was already there, and Pickett, who looked more frightened than he had at her kitchen table, but also more resolved. The fear and the resolution sitting side by side on his face, the way they do in people who've made a hard decision and are going to hold to it. There were two other men she didn't know who were Cartwright's colleagues, assisting with the documentation. Pollard was there. Mercer's lawyer, a well-dressed man in his 50s with a careful, watchful stillness that she associated with people who'd learned to read rooms quickly. He looked at Martha when she came in, and his expression didn't change, which she took as professional rather than personal. Mercer was not there himself, which surprised her until Cartwright explained that he preferred not to appear in proceedings where he couldn't control the narrative. He'd sent Pollard with full authority. The hearing ran for 3 hours. Judge Webb was a compact, gray-haired man with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that suggested someone who'd been doing this for long enough that very little surprised him and very little impressed him either, and that these two qualities had achieved a kind of balance he was comfortable with. He read documents with an absolute focus that ignored the room entirely. He asked questions that cut directly to the thing he was actually trying to understand, not the surrounding matter. Cartwright laid out the case in order. The original Hale survey and its clear standing, the manufactured private survey, and the documented conflict of interest in its commission, the pattern across 6 properties, the affidavits, and then Pickett. Cord Pickett testified for 40 minutes. He was not smooth about it. His voice shook once or twice. His hands were not still, but he was specific and he was consistent, and when Pollard cross-examined him, the specificity held. He knew the dates. He knew the amounts. He knew the names. Pollard argued that Pickett was a disgruntled former employee with motive to fabricate. Cartwright produced 3 corroborating documents that Pickett hadn't known about. Bank records Cartwright had obtained through the court's subpoena authority, showing payments to Dupree on the exact dates Pickett had described. Pollard objected to the introduction of the records on procedural grounds. Judge Webb looked over his glasses at Pollard and said, in the dry and patient voice of a man who had seen this move before, "Overruled. Proceed." Martha sat behind the plaintiff's table and watched it happen and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific sensation of the machinery working in the right direction. Not certainty, she still wasn't certain, but the feeling that the weight of the thing was moving, slowly and with effort, toward a reckoning. At the end of the 3 hours, Judge Webb did not render a final judgment. That would come later, after written submissions. But he suspended the private survey's legal standing pending full review, which meant the boundary dispute was frozen, which meant Mercer could not proceed on the Hale property or the Beale property through the courts while the investigation was open. He also ordered the county recorder's records to be preserved and submitted to his court, which meant Dupree could no longer quietly lose anything else. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was something. Walking out of the courthouse into the December afternoon, Martha stood on the stone steps and breathed the cold air and looked at the street where people were moving about their ordinary business, not knowing or caring what had just happened in a hearing room 40 feet away. Horace Beale came to stand beside her. He had his hat in his hands and he was looking at the street. 14 months, he said. Almost over, she said. Maybe. He looked at her. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly. She thought about the 42 cents on the first Saturday, the letter from her father to a man he trusted with a debt, the burned stand and the cedar posts going into the ground on a Saturday morning with 6 people's hands on them. She thought about Eli in the smokehouse at dawn. She thought about Daniel's hand in hers. Like it matters, she said. Like what we did got up in the morning and came to work. Beale looked at her for a moment. Your father raised someone worth raising, he said. He put his hat back on and walked down the steps to where the horses were tied. Silas was standing by the wagon. He'd been inside for the hearing, had heard everything, and he looked now like a man who'd been carrying something a long time and had felt it lighten slightly without quite putting it down yet. She walked to where he was. She stood beside him and looked at the street. 14 months for Beale, she said. 4 months for us. Not done yet, he said. No, she said. But something shifted in there. You felt it. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I felt it. She looked at the cold sky above the city, the high blue of a December day in Texas, the particular light that comes before the sun starts to drop. She thought about her boys at the Ferris place, probably driving Louise crazy, probably fine. She thought about the smokehouse sitting banked and waiting, and the cedar stand on the road, and the hickory wood stacked along the barn wall, and the cabin with the repaired roof and the new porch boards, and the door that finally hung right. She thought about what it would take to finish this, what it would cost, what she was willing to pay. All of it, she thought. I'm willing to pay all of it. Let's go home, she said. You said, Part 5. Louis. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5 lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả quá mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đàn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 957. Claude responded, Part 5. What we build and what we keep. Part 5. What we build and what we keep.
Judge Webb's written ruling came in the third week of January. Cartwright rode up from Bandera himself to deliver it, which Martha took as a sign before she'd even read a word. A lawyer who brings bad news sends a letter. A lawyer who brings something worth seeing delivers it in person.
He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Cord Pickett had told his story, where she'd read Mercer's legal letter in the lamplight, where she'd unfolded and refolded the same document so many times the creases had gone soft. And he set the ruling down and let her read it. She read it once, then she sat back. "Tell me what it means," she said, in plain language. Cartwright folded his hands on the table. "It means the private survey is invalidated. The boundary dispute is dismissed with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled on the same grounds. Your land is yours, clear and uncontested." He paused. "It also means the court has referred the evidence of corruption, the Dupree payments, the manipulation of the county recorder's office, to the state attorney's office for investigation. That's out of our hands now. It moves at its own speed."
And Mercer?
"The freight road project is suspended pending the state investigation. He's not in a cell, not yet, and possibly not ever, depending on how aggressively the state pursues it. Men like Mercer have resources that make criminal prosecution difficult." He looked at her carefully. "I want to be honest with you about that. The land is safe. The corruption is documented and in the hands of people with the authority to act on it. Whether Mercer ultimately faces a court for what he's done, I can't promise you that." She looked at the ruling on the table. She'd known this was possible. She'd thought about Walt Weatherby in the rooming house in Kerrville, who'd said he wins because he has money and judges. And she'd thought about how money and judges were exactly what they'd spent 4 months dismantling. They hadn't dismantled the money. Not entirely. Maybe not enough. "What about the families who already sold?" she asked. "The Garners, the others." Cartwright's expression shifted slightly. "That's more complicated. The investigation may surface grounds for civil remedies. Dupree's manipulation of the recording process potentially voids transactions conducted under fraudulent documentation. But that's years of litigation if it happens at all. I won't tell you it's certain." "Years," she said. "Years," he confirmed. He was not a man who softened things to be kind, which was why she trusted him. She looked at the window. Outside, January had settled over the hill country with a gray, steady cold that was neither brutal nor gentle. Just the particular weight of winter on a landscape that had been through a hard year and would have to go through more before anything new came up. The smokehouse was running. She'd kept it running through the fall and into winter, and the Saturday market had moved indoors to the feed store's covered loading dock, and she'd been selling out consistently enough that she'd stopped being surprised by it. "Martha," Cartwright said, "your land is safe. That was the core of this. Everything else, the investigation, the state attorney, Mercer's future, those are real, and they matter, but they're not the thing you were fighting for at the beginning." She looked at him. "At the beginning, I was fighting to feed my boys." He was quiet. "And then I was fighting to keep the land," she said. "And then it became something bigger than that. The Teagues, the Garners, the Weatherbys. It became about all of them. And now you're telling me I got half of it." She paused. She heard how that sounded. She thought about whether it was fair or ungrateful or simply true. "That's still more than most people get," she said. "I know that." "It is," he said. She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard. Eli was at the fence line with a hatchet, clearing a section of brush that had grown up over the fall. Silas was somewhere. She could hear hammering from the direction of the barn, a repair he'd been working on for 2 days. Daniel was nowhere visible, which meant he was either in the barn with Silas or had found a project of his own that he wasn't advertising. The land was hers. That was real. That was a thing that had been taken from her systematically through corruption and pressure and deliberate cruelty, and she had fought it back. She had done that. Not alone. She'd had Silas and Cartwright and Beale and Vera Drummond and Louise Ferris and a half-dozen people who'd shown up on a Saturday with hammers. But she had been the one who'd decided not to sell, not to move, not to let it be easier to give up than to stay. She thought about what her father had said about things you build with your hands being real in a way that arguments aren't. She thought about what she'd built. She thought about what had been built around it. "Send Horace Beale the ruling when you can," she said. "He should see it." "Already have," Cartwright said. He asked me to tell you. He said thank you. She turned from the window. For what? For not selling, Cartwright said simply. She told Silas that evening, after the boys were in bed. She told him what the ruling said and what Cartwright had said about Mercer and the limitations of it, and he listened the way he always listened, entirely, without rushing her toward a conclusion. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. It's enough, he said. Is it? For what you set out to do, yes. He looked at her. You can't fix everything he's done, Martha. You can fix what's in front of you and contribute to fixing what's beside you and hope that the thing you started is big enough that other people finish it. He paused. That's how things actually change. Not all at once. In pieces, over time, by people who don't get to see all of it. She looked at him. Is that supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be true, he said. I find it more useful than comforting. She almost laughed. She was tired in a particular way. Not the grinding exhaustion of the early months, not the fear-flavored sleeplessness, but the deep tiredness of someone who has been doing something hard for a long time and has just been told they can stop. It was, in its way, harder to carry than the fighting kind. Silas, she said. Yeah. She looked at the fire in the hearth. She'd been putting off this conversation for a long time, moving it around her like furniture she kept walking past without deciding where to put it. What happens now, for you? He looked at the fire, too. He had the look he got when he was deciding to be honest about something he hadn't entirely worked out yet. I've been thinking about that, he said. And I don't want to leave, he said. It came out plain, without decoration, without the slightly sideways construction she'd learned to recognize as the thing he did when he was protecting himself. Just plain. I don't know exactly what that means or what you want it to mean, but I don't want to go back to moving just to keep moving. And this... He stopped. He looked at the room, the table, the fire. This is the first place I've been in years where the morning felt like something I was walking toward instead of away from. She looked at him. I know that doesn't... He stopped again. He was not, in the end, a man who found this easy, and she found that she appreciated it. A man who found it easy would have said it too soon, too polished, and she'd have known it was performance. This was not performance. I know it doesn't resolve into anything neat, he said. I'm not asking for neat. What are you asking for? She said. He thought about it. The chance to stay, he said, and see what it is, on whatever terms make sense to you. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Robert, which she hadn't done in a long time. Not with anger, not with grief, just the bare fact of him, a man she'd been wrong about, and had built part of her life around and whose absence had turned out, in the end, to matter less than she'd thought it would. She thought about what she'd learned about herself in the absence, about what she was capable of, and what she needed and what she didn't need. She thought about Eli asking, what does Silas think, and the way the question had come out natural and unguarded, the way you ask about someone who has become part of the structure of things. The boys are part of this, she said. That's not a complication. That's just what's true. I know, he said. I'd have it no other way. She looked at him for a long moment. Stay, she said. See what it is. That's all I have right now, too. That's enough, he said. The fire snapped once. Outside, the January wind moved through the cedar along the fence line with a dry, papery sound. She thought about her father writing a letter in a dying man's careful hand to someone he trusted across whatever distance lay between them, and she thought that whatever he'd hoped for when he wrote it, this might have been close. Spring came the way it always did in the hill country, not announcing itself, just appearing in increments. A morning warmer than the one before, something green in the dry grass, the creek rising slightly, slow with snowmelt from the hills to the north. The county recorder, Dupree, resigned in February. The state attorney's investigation had become public by then, and his resignation had the quality of a man who'd been told what was coming and had made a calculation about the least damaging version of it. 2 weeks later, a name appeared in the Bandera County paper, a judge in Fredericksburg named Harlan, who was being asked to answer questions he had not been asked before. Martha read the item twice and put the paper down and didn't make a production of it, because the thing about justice moving slowly is that it keeps moving even when you stop watching it, and the best you can do is note it and go back to work. Mercer himself did not flee. He stayed on his spread north of town and kept a low public profile and retained 2 lawyers and released a statement through Pollard, saying he looked forward to the investigation demonstrating his full compliance with the law. The freight road project remained suspended. 2 of his smaller business operations in the county had already begun to contract. Suppliers and partners quietly recalibrating, the way people do when a man's star is clearly on the way down, even if he hasn't finished falling yet. Vera Drummond had his best assessment of it. She told Martha over tea in March, "He's not finished. Men like that find ways to survive, but he's reduced. He'll spend the next years managing what's left instead of taking more. That's the best outcome most of us live to see." Martha thought about that. Reduced? Not destroyed, not punished with anything satisfying or proportionate. Reduced. She turned it over and decided it was honest, and that honest was worth more than the version where the story ended cleanly, because clean wasn't something the world reliably delivered. "What about the families?" she asked. "The ones who sold?" Vera looked at her over the rim of the teacup. The state investigation found irregularities in at least 2 of the transactions. The Garner's sale and one other. "There's a civil case being built." She paused. "It'll take time. It may not fully restore what they lost, but Roy Garner knows that what was done to him is on record now. That he wasn't imagining it, wasn't weak, that it was done to him by a man with resources and corruption behind him, and that it's been said so out loud in a court document." She set down the cup. "I've seen what it does to a person, not having that. Carrying what happened with no one acknowledging it was real. Sometimes the acknowledgement is the thing that matters most." Martha thought about Ada Garner's letter, the one that had smelled of cheap soap, the one that said, "I'm sorry," in a way that had hurt her to read, because Ada had nothing to apologize for. She made a note to write to Ada again. Not about the case, just to say she was thinking of her. She opened the restaurant in May. It wasn't a grand opening. She wasn't that kind of person, and it wasn't that kind of place. She unlocked the door on a Saturday morning and put a sign out, and the first customers who came in were Louise and Bill Ferris, who sat at the nearest table and ordered coffee and smoked pork and cornbread and made no more ceremony of it than that, which was exactly right. The building had been a vacant dry goods store at the edge of the main street, empty for 2 years. Ben Holloway had helped her negotiate the lease, which was lower than it should have been because the owner, an older man named Prescott, who'd been following the situation with Mercer with more than casual interest, had decided on a price that reflected his own quiet reckoning with which side of things he wanted to be associated with. She didn't comment on that. She signed the lease and went to work. Silas had done most of the interior work: counters, shelves, the wall hooks, the repair of 2 windows that had been stuck in their frames. Eli had helped with everything Silas would let him help with, which was most of it. Daniel had been primarily a foreman, directing operations from a height he'd achieved by standing on a crate, and his assessments had been offered freely whether or not they were requested. The menu was simple. Smoked pork in 2 preparations, beans cooked the way she'd always cooked them, cornbread, and a brisket she'd developed over the winter that had become the thing people came back for. She had her father's smokehouse knowledge, and she had months of practice, and she had the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd decided that the thing she knew how to do was worth doing right every time, not just when it was easy. By noon on that first Saturday, the 4 tables were full, and people were waiting. By the following Saturday, she was turning people away by 1 o'clock and had already decided she needed to rethink the setup. Horace Beale came down from his spread that second Saturday and sat at the counter and ate brisket and didn't say much, which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You built something," he said when he was leaving. "We built something," she said. He looked at her with those steady eyes. "I mean you," he said carefully. "I mean you specifically. Don't talk yourself out of the credit." She thought about that for a long time after he left. What she kept coming back to, in the quiet moments, and there were more quiet moments now, which was its own kind of adjustment, was the question of what the last year had actually been about. She was not a woman who went in for grand conclusions. She'd spent too much time in proximity to the actual texture of things to believe that life organized itself around lessons. But she kept coming back to one thing that was simpler and less comfortable than a lesson. She kept coming back to the day in August when she'd stood at the horse trough in the afternoon heat, newly home from the first market, 42 cents in her pocket and a long way to go, and she'd asked herself whether she could hold on. And the answer had been, not alone, no. And the thing that had changed wasn't her becoming stronger or more capable or more deserving. The thing that had changed was that she'd stopped treating the need for other people as a weakness to be managed, and had started treating it as a fact to be worked with. She thought about how long she'd spent trying to do everything herself, not out of genuine competence, but out of a terror of being found wanting, of proving the town right, of giving anyone additional ammunition. And she thought about how much of that struggle had been unnecessary. Not because people were good exactly, not because Caldwell Crossing had turned out to be secretly generous and kind. Some of them were. Many of them weren't. But some of them, given a reason and a moment where the cost of doing the right thing was manageable, had shown up. And some of them had needed her strength to find their own. That was the thing she couldn't have seen from the other side of it. That standing your ground wasn't just about your ground. It was about what it gave other people permission to do. Vera Drummond and her guilt about the Teagues, Ben Holloway and his sign in the window, Ellis Cutter and his saw on a Saturday morning. They'd been waiting, in different ways, for someone to make the first move. Not because they were cowards, or not only because of that, but because the first move costs the most, and people reasonably calculate whether they can afford it. She'd been in a position where she couldn't not afford it. She had too little left to lose. And paradoxically, having too little left to lose had made her the one who could afford to go first. She wasn't sure if that was irony or just the way things worked. On a Thursday evening in June, more than a year after Silas had come down the creek road on a gray horse with a loaded mule behind him, she was closing up the restaurant, wiping down the counter, the last customer gone, the place quiet and smelling of smoke and coffee, and the particular combination of beeswax and cedar that the building had taken on as its own smell, when she heard the boys outside. Eli was teaching Daniel something. She could hear it in the quality of the exchange. Eli's slightly older, patient voice explaining Daniel's frequent interruptions with questions that were either genuinely curious or designed to test Eli's patience, and probably both. She couldn't make out the words, just the shape of it. She stood behind the counter with the cloth in her hand and she listened. This was what she'd been fighting for, not the land, not the case, not the ruling. Those were the mechanisms of it. The actual thing was this. Her boys outside in the summer evening, one teaching the other, no hunger in the air, no fear in the house, enough normal days stacked up behind them that normal had started to feel like what it was supposed to be. Silas came in from the back where he'd been banking the smokehouse for the night. He looked at her standing at the counter and he said, "Boys still out there?" "Eli's explaining something to Daniel," she said. "He's been explaining things to Daniel all afternoon," Silas said. He went to the shelf for the coffee pot. Danny asked him why the smoke from the smokehouse is a different color in the morning than in the afternoon, and Eli spent 40 minutes on it. Was he right? Mostly. He poured 2 cups. He got a little creative in the middle, but the conclusion was sound. She put the cloth down. She took the coffee he held out to her and leaned against the counter, and looked at this man who had stayed, who had become, without ceremony or announcement, the person who knew where everything was in her kitchen and which fence post on the north line was going to need replacing before winter, and exactly how much to add to the smokehouse fire at 2 in the morning to keep it running right. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. The civil case for the Garners was moving through the courts in San Antonio at the pace that such things moved. Walt Weatherby was still in his rooming house in Kerrville, and she didn't know if he'd ever be anything other than what he was. Mercer was still on his spread north of town, reduced but not gone, and men like him didn't disappear. They recalculated and waited and found new angles, and the only answer to that was permanent watchfulness, which was exhausting and necessary and could not be avoided. The world was not better because Martha Hale had kept her land and opened a restaurant. She wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. The frontier was still hard and corrupt in places, and indifferent to ordinary people in ways that no single case or ruling or Saturday work party could change. But it was different. In this county, in this town, in the specific network of people who'd been touched by what had happened, it was different. Dupree was gone. Harlan was under investigation. The families who'd been hurt had their names in court documents that said, in the language of law, this was done to you and it was wrong. There were people in Caldwell Crossing who would never look the other way about something like this again, not because they'd become better people overnight, but because they'd learned, slowly and imperfectly, what it cost to look away. That was real. It had happened, and it was real.
She thought about her father, Franklin Decker, who'd built his smokehouse and tended it with patience and had believed, right to the end, that what you made with your hands was the truest thing about you, who'd seen his daughter from a long way away through a dying man's eyes and had understood what she needed and had trusted an old debt to deliver it. She hoped he'd gotten the chance to be surprised by her. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked. "My father," she said. He nodded like that was the expected answer and sipped his coffee. "Silas. Are you happy?" He looked at her. He thought about it, genuinely, the way he thought about things that deserved real answers. He looked around the restaurant, at the tables and the counter and the window with the sign she'd painted herself, and then at the open back door where the evening light was coming in warm and flat, the summer sound of it, the boys' voices somewhere in it. "Yeah," he said. "I am." A pause. "You?" She thought about 42 cents. She thought about a burned stand and a cedar post and a man who'd said good smoke on this without hesitation. She thought about 2 boys in a rope bed, breathing. "Yeah," she said. "I am." Eli turned 10 that summer. He asked for a real lesson in the smokehouse. Not just watching, not just helping, but running a smoking himself from start to finish, making every decision, with Martha only there to answer questions he specifically asked. She agreed, and he spent 2 days on it, serious and focused, and what came out of the smokehouse at the end of those 2 days was good. Not perfect, slightly oversalted, the smoke a fraction heavy, but genuinely good. The kind of good that had another 10 years of practice waiting behind it. She told him exactly that, which was what her father would have done, and he took it the way she'd learned to take that kind of feedback. The pride and the dissatisfaction at once, the knowledge that the gap between good and better was a road, not a verdict. Daniel, who had been waiting to try whatever Eli tried for the duration of his existence, immediately announced that he wanted to do a smoking next. "You're 6, Eli said. "I'm almost 7. "That's the same as 6. "Mama," Daniel said. "Next spring," Martha said, "when you're actually 7. She looked at Daniel's face and added, "You can help your brother clean the firebox." Daniel thought about this. "What does that involve?" "A lot of ash," Eli said. Daniel considered the trade-off. "I'll do it," he said. Silas, who was at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because he'd been listening to this exchange longer than he'd intended to, made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, a short one, quickly contained, but real. It was the kind of laugh that came out of a man who hadn't laughed that easily in a while, who was getting the habit back. Martha looked at him from across the room, and he looked at her, and there was nothing that needed to be said about it, which was its own kind of language. Outside, the summer evening was coming on, the sky over the ridge going the color that Texas skies go in June, that particular copper and rose, and the air was warm but not punishing, and the cedar stand on the road was standing, and the smokehouse behind it was running, and the 2 boys at the table were arguing about ash with the unselfconscious vigor of people who have no reason to believe the ground will move under them. This was what had been built, not a monument, not a victory in the clean storybook sense. Something more ordinary and more durable than that. A family that had been broken down to its bare components and had put itself back together around a different shape, stranger, harder won, with people in it who hadn't been there at the start, and a history that had cost something real and hadn't been forgotten but had been slowly and imperfectly absorbed. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. For the people the stories didn't usually follow, the ones who didn't have armies or fortunes, or the particular kind of courage that announces itself. The ones who had the other kind, the quiet, daily, unremarkable courage of getting up in the morning and going back to the same problem and refusing to decide that the outcome was fixed. Martha Hale had refused. And the land was hers, and the boys were fed, and the evening was warm, and the smoke was rising clean and steady from a fire she'd built herself. That was the whole story. That was enough.